Beneath the streets of Vatican City, locked behind reinforced doors that few human eyes have ever passed through, sits over 53 miles of shelving. Millions of documents, some catalogued, some sealed, some, according to certain researchers, historians, and more than a few whistleblowers over the decades, never meant to be found at all. Officially, it's called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Unofficially, people have been calling it something else for centuries. The Forbidden Archive. And tonight we're going looking for 6 documents that supposedly live somewhere inside it. Documents that, if they're real, could rewrite what we think we know about prophecy, about ancient technology, about the Church's own hidden history. Documents the Vatican says either don't exist, were destroyed, or were never quite what people think they were. Now, if you're settling in with this one, drifting off, letting my voice carry you somewhere between awake and asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So subscribe if you haven't, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing it. Tokyo at midnight, Chicago right before bed, someone in London just waking up to it on their commute. It's a strange, wonderful feeling knowing this one story is drifting through so many time zones at once. Here's the thing about the Vatican Archive. It's not really one archive. It's centuries of accumulated paperwork, letters, testimonies, confessions, secret reports from nuncios stationed across the world, correspondence with kings and heretics and scientists alike. Popes have been squirreling away sensitive material since before the printing press existed. And whenever an institution holds that much power for that long, whispers start. Whispers about what they're really protecting. Whispers about the 6 documents we're covering tonight, each one tied to a different thread of forbidden history. A prophecy the Church allegedly never told the full truth about. A machine that some swear could see into the past. Files on encounters the Church supposedly can't explain. A gospel that contradicts everything modern Christianity is built on. Records of a pope who, according to legend, was never supposed to exist. And a treasure inventory belonging to an order the Church itself helped destroy. We're not here to tell you these things are definitely real. Most of what we're about to walk through lives in that foggy space between documented history and persistent legend. The kind of story that refuses to die no matter how many times it's debunked. But that persistence is interesting all on its own. So if you enjoy shows like this, the easiest way to support what we do is by finding us on Spotify, following there, and if you've got a spare moment, leaving a 5-star review. Links in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Let's start with the one that started it all. Fátima, 1917. Number 1 on our list, and maybe the document that started every other rumour about this archive. The unabridged Third Secret of Fátima. Picture Portugal in the spring of 1917. Europe is tearing itself apart. The First World War has already swallowed millions of young men into trenches and mud, and word of that horror has reached even the small farming villages where news mostly travels by rumour and church gossip. In a place called Fátima, about 70 miles north of Lisbon, 3 shepherd children are doing what shepherd children have done for generations. Watching sheep in a rocky pasture called the Cova da Uria, killing time, probably arguing about something small the way kids do. Lucia dos Santos is 10 years old. Her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Mato are 9 and 7. And on May 13th, according to what they would later tell anyone who asked, and eventually plenty of people who didn't, the sky changes. A flash of light. Then standing above a small holm oak bush, a woman brighter than anything they'd ever seen, glowing so intensely Lucia would later struggle to find words for it. The woman speaks. She asks the children to return to that same spot on the 13th of each month for 6 months. She asks them to pray the rosary for peace, and she tells them something else, something the children barely understand yet, but that will define the rest of their lives. that she has a message, not just one, but several, and that the full message will come in pieces. Now, if this were just 3 children telling stories, this whole thing dies quietly, the way most of these stories do. But it doesn't stay quiet. Word spreads through Fatima almost immediately. And what happens next is the part that even skeptical historians have a hard time waving away. Word gets around that the mysterious lady promised a miracle for October, something everyone would be able to see, something that would prove the children weren't lying. And on October 13th, 1917, somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 people show up. Believers, skeptics, journalists from Lisbon's anti-clerical newspapers, who came specifically expecting to catch 3 peasant children in an elaborate hoax. It had been raining for days. The crowd is standing in mud, soaked through, when, according to an enormous number of eyewitness accounts, many of them from people who had shown up hostile to the whole idea, the clouds part and the sun begins to move, not just brighten. Move. Witnesses describe it spinning, changing colours, plunging toward the earth in a way that terrified people into dropping to their knees in the mud, crying, praying, convinced the world was ending. This event gets recorded in newspapers the following day, including publications that had zero interest in promoting a miracle. To this day, nobody has a fully satisfying scientific explanation for what tens of thousands of people in that field say they witnessed. Atmospheric optical illusion, mass hysteria, some combination the human mind isn't built to process cleanly. Whatever it was, it turned Fatima from a local curiosity into something the wider world couldn't ignore. But here's what people forget when they talk about Fatima. The sun miracle wasn't the main event for Lucia. It was the messages that mattered, the ones the lady in the light had been delivering across those monthly visits, messages that eventually got organised into what the Church would call the 3 Secrets of Fatima. The first secret was a vision of hell, vivid, terrifying, the kind of thing that would leave a 10-year-old shaken for the rest of her life. The second secret predicted a second, even worse world war, and specifically named Russia as a source of coming devastation to the world, a startling claim from a child in a country that, at the time, had no way of anticipating the Bolshevik revolution that was about to unfold that same year. 2 of the 3 secrets, terrifying as they were, eventually became public knowledge, written down and shared with church authorities in relatively short order. But it's the 3rd secret where the story stops being simple history and starts becoming something else entirely. Something people have spent over a century arguing about. Because Lucia, the only one of the 3 children who would survive into adulthood, both Francisco and Jacinta died young in the influenza epidemic that swept the world not long after, was told to write the 3rd secret down. And when she finally did, years later, she was told to seal it. Not read it aloud, not explain it, seal it in an envelope, hand it to her bishop, and let it travel up through the church hierarchy until it landed. Eventually, in Rome itself unopened, waiting for a date Lucia herself specified before anyone was allowed to look inside. That sealed envelope is where our story really begins to get interesting. It took Lucia decades to put it on paper, not because she had forgotten it. According to her later accounts, she remembered the message with painful clarity, but the instruction, as she understood it, was that the final part was not meant for immediate release. It was to be held back, protected, kept out of public hands until the right moment. And then, in the early 1940s, her health began to fail. Lucia had become a Dorothean sister by then, living a life far removed from the crowds and controversy that had followed Fatima. She was no longer the little girl in the pasture. She was Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus, and of the Immaculate Heart, a religious sister under obedience to her superiors, and the last living witness to the events that had made her famous. But she was also seriously ill. Church officials worried that if she died without recording the 3rd secret, Whatever she had been entrusted with could die with her. So her bishop, José Alves Correa da Silva of Leiria, asked her to write it down. That sounds straightforward. A bishop asks, a nun writes. A document gets filed away, but Lucia reportedly struggled with it. She had written the first 2 secrets in her memoirs, but this one was different. This was the part she believed she had been told not to reveal freely. For a time she said she simply could not bring herself to write it. Then after prayer, she did. On January 3rd, 1944, Lucia wrote the secret in her own hand. The manuscript was small, just a few pages. 4 sheets, according to the descriptions that would later emerge. That is one of the strangest details in this entire story. For something that has generated more speculation than almost any modern church document, the original text was physically tiny. No massive leather-bound prophecy, no medieval vault filled with coded pages. Just handwriting on paper from a cloistered nun, composed under pressure while war was consuming Europe again. But the paper mattered because of what Lucia did next. She placed the manuscript inside an envelope and sealed it. Then that envelope was placed inside another envelope. The outer envelope carried instructions in her handwriting. It was not to be opened before 1960. Depending on the version of the instruction being cited, it could be opened by the Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon or by the Bishop of Leiria after that date. The key point was the date itself, 1960. Why 1960? Lucia reportedly explained that by then, the message would be clearer. Not necessarily because some dramatic event was scheduled for that exact year, not because a clock would strike midnight and suddenly reveal the meaning, but because, in her words, people would understand it better then. Think about what that meant in 1944. The Second World War was still raging. Nazi Germany occupied huge areas of Europe. The atomic bomb had not yet been dropped. The Cold War had not yet begun. The Soviet Union was an ally against Hitler, not yet the enemy at the centre of a global nuclear standoff. Nobody knew exactly what the world of 1960 would look like. And yet this sealed text, written by a woman who had spent most of her adult life behind convent walls, was marked with a date 16 years in the future. That alone gave the document an almost unbearable sense of suspense. The bishop kept it for a time. It was not circulated among priests. It was not read from a pulpit. It was not published in a newspaper. It was treated less like ordinary correspondence and more like a dangerous object, something that had to be preserved intact and passed carefully from one set of hands to another. Eventually, the envelope made its way to Rome. By the late 1950s, it was being held by the Vatican, reportedly in the archive of the Holy Office, the institution now known as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. This is important, because people hear Vatican archives and imagine one giant locked basement underneath St. Peter's Basilica. The reality is more bureaucratic, and in some ways more mysterious. The Vatican has many archives, departments, private papal files, diplomatic records, doctrinal offices, and restricted collections. A document can be in the Vatican without being accessible to historians, journalists, or even most senior clergy. And the Third Secret was not just any file. It was handwritten by the last surviving Fátima visionary. It was sealed under specific instructions. It had a date attached to it. And it concerned a phenomenon the Church had approached with extraordinary caution from the very beginning. By the time it reached Rome, it carried the weight of decades of prayer, fear, politics, and expectation. Every pope who knew of it faced the same impossible problem. If you read it, what do you do with it? If you release it, you risk causing panic, confusion, or a tidal wave of interpretation. If you keep it private, you create exactly the kind of silence that makes people imagine the worst. And before we go any further, If unexplained documents, vanished records, and historical mysteries like this are your thing, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description, because Fatima is only the beginning. For now, though, picture that envelope sitting in Rome, small enough to fit in a drawer, sealed shut, marked with a date that had now arrived, and somewhere inside the Vatican, men who had spent their lives reading theology, intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and confessions of human darkness were about to confront a message no one outside a tiny circle had seen for more than 15 years. Then came the year 2000. By then, the Third Secret had been waiting in the Vatican for more than 4 decades. Popes had read it, officials had discussed it, rumours had multiplied in the vacuum. Some people expected a prophecy about nuclear war. Others expected a warning of apostasy, a collapse of the Church, a global catastrophe, maybe the end of the world itself. Every year the envelope remained closed, made the expectations bigger. And then Pope John Paul II decided it was time. The timing was not random. May 13th, 2000 was the anniversary of the first reported apparition at Fatima. It was also the day Francisco and Jacinta Marto, the 2 children who had died shortly after the events of 1917, were beatified by the Pope at the Fatima Shrine in Portugal. Thousands of pilgrims gathered. The ceremony was emotional, historic, and watched around the world. Near the end, Cardinal Angelo Sodano, then the Vatican Secretary of State, made an announcement. The Third Secret, he said, would be published. For believers who had waited decades, this was enormous. The locked door was finally opening. The Vatican was not merely acknowledging that a text existed, it was promising to show it. The actual handwritten words of Sister Lucia. No paraphrase, no second-hand recollection, no anonymous official explaining what she had supposedly meant. A little more than a month later, on June 26, 2000, the Vatican released the document through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And what people read was not what many had expected. The text begins after the first 2 parts of the secret, with words attributed to Mary. After the 2 parts which I have already explained, at the left of Our Lady and a little above, we saw an angel with a flaming sword in his left hand. That image alone is pure Fatima. An angel, a sword, fire, a warning that appears to threaten the world itself. Sister Lucia described the flames flashing, giving off the impression that they would set the earth on fire. But then, she wrote, the flames were extinguished by the radiance that Our Lady gave off from her right hand. The angel cried out 3 times, "Penance! Penance! Penance!" Then the vision changed. The children saw what Lucia called a bishop dressed in white. They had the impression, she wrote, that it was the Holy Father. Around him were other bishops, priests, men and women religious, all climbing a steep mountain. At the top stood a large cross made from rough-hewn trunks, but the road to the cross passed through devastation. Before reaching it, the bishop in white moved through a great city that was half in ruins. He was trembling. He was afflicted with pain and sorrow. Along the way he prayed for the souls of corpses he encountered. Then, at the foot of the cross, the bishop in white was killed. So were the other religious figures around him. Then lay people as well. People of different ranks and positions were killed by soldiers firing bullets and arrows. Beneath the cross, 2 angels gathered the blood of the martyrs and sprinkled it upon souls making their way toward God. That was the text, 4 handwritten pages, a vision of an angel, a ruined city, a pope-like figure, a mountain, a cross, and a mass killing. No date, no country, no named enemy, no explicit reference to communism, nuclear weapons, the end times, or a coming worldwide disaster. Nothing that could be read like a military report or a calendar of future events. Instead, it was symbolic, violent. Yes, but symbolic in the way religious visions often are. A landscape built from images rather than coordinates. The Vatican also released supporting material. There was a theological commentary by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. There was an account from Archbishop Tarcisio Bertoni describing his conversations with Sister Lucia. And there was the official interpretation offered by Cardinal Sodano and Pope John Paul II. According to that interpretation, the central image of the bishop in white pointed toward the 20th century's persecution of Christians, its wars, its martyrs, and most specifically, the attempted assassination of John Paul II. On May 13, 1981, exactly 64 years after the first Fatima apparition, the Pope had been shot in St. Peter's Square by Mehmet Ali Agca. John Paul survived. He later credited the Virgin of Fatima with saving his life. He famously said that one hand fired the bullet, but another hand guided it. For the Vatican, that connection mattered. The Pope had been wounded. He had come close to death. He had suffered during a century when priests, nuns, bishops, and ordinary believers had been killed in enormous numbers under totalitarian regimes and in wars across the world. The vision, the Vatican argued, was not a prediction of some catastrophe still waiting ahead. It was a spiritual reading of suffering that had already unfolded. That explanation brought relief to some Catholics. The secret had been revealed, the Church had spoken. The mystery, at least, officially had an answer. But for others, the release did something unexpected. It did not end the questions, it made them sharper. And the reason was simple. The published vision did not seem to match the secret people thought they had been waiting for. Not because it was harmless. A city in ruins, a pope-like figure walking among bodies, soldiers killing bishops and believers beneath a cross. That is not harmless. It is horrifying, but to critics, it was horrifying in the wrong way. It looked like a vision that needed interpretation. What they expected was a message, a direct warning. Words that explained the images and named the danger. That expectation did not come from nowhere. For decades, people close to the Fatima story had hinted that the final part involved a crisis of faith. Not just wars or persecution from outside the Church, but confusion inside it. Some remembered statements attributed to Sister Lucia about a great spiritual struggle. Others pointed to the fact that the secret was supposed to be opened by 1960, supposedly because it would be clearer by then. And when 1960 arrived, the Vatican did not publish it. Instead, a Portuguese statement said the secret would probably remain sealed forever. That decision became one of the central pillars of the missing text theory. If the vision was only about the suffering of Christians in the 20th century, critics asked why had it been considered too sensitive to release in 1960? Why keep 4 pages of symbolic imagery behind locked doors for years? Why let rumours spread across the Catholic world rather than simply publish the text and let people read it? The answer, according to the Vatican, was caution. Private revelations are not treated like ordinary historical documents. Church officials have to consider whether publication will help believers or create panic, confusion, and endless speculation. And in fairness, they had a point. Fatima had already become one of the most emotionally charged religious stories in the modern world. Any document connected to it would be read not just as history, but as a possible map of the future. But secrecy has a strange effect on human beings. Tell people there is nothing to fear, while refusing to show them what they are not supposed to fear, and they will start imagining the worst possible thing. Then there was the question of the documents themselves. Some researchers argued that older descriptions of the Third Secret did not seem to fit the 4 handwritten pages released in 2000. They pointed to claims that the final secret had been written on a single sheet of paper, perhaps only a few dozen lines long. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who had access to the text during the 1950s, was often quoted as referring to a single page. Other accounts, including comments attributed to people who had investigated the secret, seemed to suggest a shorter document. So the theory took shape. Maybe the Vatican had released one genuine text, but not the whole thing. Maybe the 4 pages contained the vision, and maybe a separate page contained the explanation, words attributed to Mary that explained what the bishop in white, the ruined city, and the martyrs were supposed to mean. That is the heart of the unabridged secret claim, not that the 2000 document was forged. Most serious proponents do not say that. They say it may have been incomplete. One document shown to the public, another document, perhaps shorter and more direct, still hidden somewhere in the Vatican archives. And according to the theory, that missing page could contain a warning the Church did not want to release, a warning about apostasy, a loss of faith among clergy, doctrinal confusion, corruption, a future crisis in Rome itself. The exact claims vary wildly depending on who is telling the story. Some imagine a prophecy about a false pope. Others imagine a warning connected to the reforms of the 1960s. Others go further, attaching the secret to global collapse, war, or an approaching end-time scenario. But this is where the evidence becomes thin. There is no publicly verified second text. No authenticated photograph, no archive inventory that clearly says, here is the missing explanatory page. There are recollections, disputed quotations, differences in descriptions, and a lot of suspicion built from decades of silence. That is enough to keep a mystery alive. It is not enough to prove that a second manuscript exists. The Vatican has consistently denied withholding part of the secret. Archbishop Bertone, who spoke with Sister Lucia before her death in 2005, insisted that the published vision was the complete Third Secret. Sister Lucia herself reportedly affirmed that position in conversations and correspondence cited by Vatican officials. For believers who accept that account, the case is closed. For skeptics, those assurances are exactly what they would expect to hear if a second document were being protected. And that is the trap at the centre of this mystery. The absence of evidence can be read in 2 completely opposite ways. One person sees no missing page because no missing page has ever been proven. Another sees no missing page because, if it existed, the Vatican would be the one place on earth capable of keeping it hidden. If you enjoy mysteries where history, belief, documents, and rumour all collide, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. As for Fátima, the most honest conclusion is also the least satisfying. The public has a real document. It is handwritten, preserved, and officially published. But the strange path that document took, the long delay, the conflicting memories about its form, and the enormous expectations surrounding it created a shadow that has never gone away. Maybe there was never another page. Maybe the missing text exists only because people expected prophecy to sound more explicit than a vision of fire, ruins, and martyrdom. Or maybe somewhere behind the walls of the Vatican, there is still one small sheet of paper that would make the whole story look completely different. Number 2. The Chronovisor blueprints. If the Fátima mystery is about a document people suspect was withheld, the Chronovisor is something even stranger. A set of blueprints people believe may describe a device the Vatican allegedly helped hide. Not a manuscript, not a prophecy, a machine. A machine that, according to the story, could look backward through time. At the centre of it all was a Benedictine monk named Father Pellegrino Ernetti. Ernetti was not some anonymous figure posting wild claims from the shadows. He was a real person. Born in 1925, he became a priest, a scholar of ancient music, and a specialist in early Christian liturgy. He spent much of his life connected to the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, studying chants and texts from the ancient world. By all accounts, he was intelligent, educated, and deeply interested in the voices of the past. That last part matters, because Ernetti did not merely study history. He claimed, at least according to the stories that began circulating around him, that he had seen it. The legend emerged publicly in the early 1970s, when an Italian priest and writer named Father Francois Brune began telling people about a remarkable conversation. Brune had reportedly met Ernetti while travelling by boat across Venice. The two men began discussing ancient languages, theology, and the survival of old texts. Then Ernetti allegedly revealed something that sounded impossible. He said a group of scientists had constructed an instrument capable of recovering images and sounds from the past, not travelling through time, not physically stepping into ancient Rome or standing beside Napoleon at Waterloo. Something stranger than that. The past, Ernetti suggested, had not completely disappeared. Its events had somehow left traces behind. If those traces could be detected, focused and translated, then scenes from history might be observed again. Imagine hearing a voice that vanished 2,000 years ago. Imagine watching a trial, a battle, an execution, a private conversation between rulers who thought their secrets had died with them. History would no longer depend entirely on fragments, broken pottery, copied manuscripts, biased chronicles, and guesses made from bones. You could just look. That is the idea that made the Chronovisor story explode. But before it became a Vatican conspiracy, before people started connecting it to locked archives and forbidden blueprints, it was first a story about one monk with an unusual background and an unbelievable confession. Ernetti supposedly said he had not built the device alone. In some retellings, he was one member of a secret team that included physicists, engineers, and religious scholars. Names began appearing around the claim, some famous, some impossible to verify, some attached to the story decades after the fact. The alleged project was said to have drawn on brilliant minds from across Europe and America. And because Ernetti was a priest, because the Vatican was the oldest and most secretive religious institution on earth, people naturally assumed Rome had to be involved. After all, if anyone had access to centuries of hidden documents, ancient artifacts, and powerful reasons to control the past, who would make a more convincing suspect than the Vatican? But Ernetti himself was a complicated figure. He was not known primarily as a physicist. He was a monk, a musicologist, and a historian of sacred sound. He studied how ancient chants had been performed, how early liturgies had changed, how words survived across centuries, even when the original voices were gone. In a way, his academic life was already about reconstructing lost worlds from incomplete evidence. Maybe that made the Chronovisor claim feel almost poetic. A man who spent his career trying to hear echoes from the past suddenly claimed that the echoes could be made literal. And according to Brune, Ernetti did not present this as a metaphor. He described it as a secret technological achievement. He claimed the device had been used to observe specific historical moments, not vague eras, not symbolic visions, specific scenes with people, words, and events. That detail is crucial because it changed the story from an abstract thought experiment into something far more dangerous. If a device could truly recover the past, then every official version of history could be challenged. Every disputed event could be replayed. Every hidden crime could be exposed. Every miracle, betrayal, assassination, and secret meeting could be dragged out of darkness and placed under observation. And the Vatican would have an obvious problem. Its history is built on records, testimony, tradition, interpretation, and faith. Like every ancient institution, it contains gaps, lost letters, conflicting accounts, documents that survived only in copies made centuries later. A machine that could revisit the past would not just reveal forgotten information. It could overturn entire foundations of accepted history. So why would anyone tell the world such a machine existed? That is where Father Ernetti's story becomes even more unsettling. Because he allegedly did not claim the Chronovisor had been created for entertainment, or even for ordinary historical research. He suggested that its creators had realized the knowledge was too powerful, that the ability to look into the past could become a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever possessed. And if that was true, then somewhere there may once have been plans, diagrams, notes, or instructions connected to the project. The blueprints people now swear were hidden away. What would those blueprints actually show? According to the legend, the Chronovisor was not a sleek time machine with a glowing screen and a keyboard full of dates. It was supposedly a large, complicated apparatus made from antennas, screens, recording equipment, and components designed to capture something far more elusive than radio waves. The residue of history itself. The basic idea was that nothing ever truly vanishes. Every word spoken, every movement made, every flash of light reflected from a face supposedly sends energy out into the universe. We know that sound is vibration, light is radiation. Radio signals can travel through space for years, somewhere. Somehow, the story claims the physical traces of past events remain woven into the fabric of reality. Not stored neatly, like files in a celestial library, more like signals scattered through an ocean during a storm. The Chronovisor, in theory, was built to find those signals. Think about trying to hear one whispered sentence in the middle of a stadium packed with screaming people. You would need a microphone sensitive enough to isolate that one voice. You would need filters powerful enough to remove everything else. And you would need to know exactly where to point the device, exactly what frequency to search, exactly what distortions to correct. Now make the problem infinitely worse. The whisper happened 2,000 years ago. The stadium is the entire universe. The noise includes every conversation, every lightning strike, every radio transmission, every star, every living thing, and every particle that has moved since the beginning of time. That is what makes the alleged device so extraordinary. It was not supposed to simply play the past back. It was supposed to calculate it. Stories about the Chronovisor describe a system that could tune into a particular place and moment, then reconstruct images and sounds from the information remaining there. One account imagines a screen displaying scenes from antiquity, almost like a television broadcast from another age. Another suggests its operators had to enter complex coordinates, dates, locations, languages, perhaps even the identities of the people they wanted to observe. The machine would then focus. A room in ancient Rome, a battlefield swallowed by grass centuries ago, a vanished speech. A trial nobody recorded, a moment seen by human eyes once, then lost forever. And this is where the supposed blueprints become so important. If they existed, they would not just be drawings of wires and panels. They would be the instruction manual for the most powerful historical tool ever conceived. They might reveal how the machine was meant to identify temporal signals, how it separated one place from another, how it converted invisible traces into pictures, how it supposedly decoded voices spoken in languages no one had heard for millennia. Even more unsettling, the plans might show whether the Chronovisor was only designed to observe the past, or whether observation was just the beginning. Because once you believe a machine can locate an event in time, the next question comes naturally. Could it watch any event? Could it follow a person across an entire lifetime? Could it listen through palace walls? Could it recover private confessions, military plans, secret negotiations, or crimes whose evidence was deliberately destroyed? History has always been protected by decay. Paper burns. Witnesses die. Memories shift. Empires collapse and take their records with them. That forgetting is tragic, but it also creates privacy for the dead. A chronovisor would erase that privacy completely. No secret would stay buried just because enough time had passed. And that may be why the alleged design is often described as something closer to a weapon than a research instrument. Not a weapon that destroys cities, a weapon that destroys uncertainty. Imagine governments using it to settle territorial claims by watching who arrived first. Imagine intelligence agencies scanning past meetings between rivals. Imagine religious authorities using it to investigate miracles, heresies, betrayals, and the private lives of saints. Imagine what wealthy people, political leaders, or dictators might pay to know what their enemies did 10 years ago, 50 years ago, or 500 years ago. The past would become a surveillance state with no expiration date. And if you like mysteries where the line between hidden history and impossible technology starts to blur, our book about 12 unexplained mysteries goes even deeper into cases that refuse to stay neatly explained. You can find it through the website link in the description. But the Chronovisor story goes further than a machine that merely watches. Some versions say the device required operators to choose the right harmonic signature for a person or event. In other words, every moment may have had its own unique pattern, like a fingerprint. Find the pattern, lock onto it, and the past appears. That sounds almost mystical, but it also gives the alleged blueprints a strange kind of internal logic. They would need charts, formulas, calibration methods, perhaps maps of frequencies connected to time, matter, and human voices. Not just engineering diagrams, a new physics of memory. And that raises the question nobody can avoid. If the machine was real, why has no verified version ever appeared? Why are there no public demonstrations, no surviving technical manuals, no independent laboratories using the same principles? The people who believe the story have an answer. They say the machine was never meant to be public. They say the blueprints, if they were preserved at all, were locked away precisely because the people behind the project understood what they had created. Not a window into history, a key to every locked door the past ever left behind. And according to the legend, the most dangerous thing about that key was not what it could reveal about ancient empires or forgotten kings. It was what it could reveal about the moments at the centre of Christianity itself. And then there was the photograph, not a blueprint, not a whispered recollection from a priest, not a claim about equations, frequencies, or machines hidden behind monastery walls. A photograph. In 1972, Italian publications printed an image said to be one of the Chronovisor's most astonishing captures, Christ on the cross, seen at the moment of crucifixion. For believers in the story, this was the evidence that changed everything. Because anyone can claim to have built an impossible machine. Anyone can describe dials, antennas, strange metals, secret committees, and lost technical notes. But a photograph feels different. A photograph seems solid. It gives the eye something to hold on to, it says. Look! This happened. Someone saw it. The image showed a crucified figure with a bowed head, a crown of thorns, and a body twisted under its own weight. It was grainy, stark, and exactly what you would expect an image from the 1st century to look like if it had somehow passed through an experimental machine from the 20th. Not too clear, not too polished, just unclear enough to feel mysterious. And that detail matters. If the photograph had been sharp, as a modern studio portrait, people would have dismissed it immediately. If it had been completely unreadable, nobody would have cared. But it sat in that dangerous middle ground, clear enough to recognize, blurry enough to invite belief. Think about how powerful that is. Human beings are built to find faces in clouds, patterns in static, meaning in shadows. Give us an unclear image connected to the biggest story in Western history, and our minds do the rest. We fill in the blood, the pain, the dust, the crowd beyond the frame, the sound of people shouting beneath the cross. Suddenly, it is no longer a picture. It is a witness. According to the Chronovisor legend, the machine had supposedly been tuned to Jerusalem during the execution of Jesus. The operators were said to have watched scenes from the Gospel story unfold as if history itself had become a broadcast signal. The photograph was presented as a fragment from that impossible viewing session. A glimpse of the central event of Christianity, captured not by a Roman soldier, not by a disciple, not by an artist working centuries later, but by a device operating nearly 2,000 years after the fact. If true, it would be impossible to overstate what that meant. Every debate about the physical details of the crucifixion would suddenly change. The shape of the cross, the position of Christ's body, the appearance of the crown of thorns, the landscape, the people present, the final words, all of it could, in theory, be observed directly. Theologians would not just be interpreting ancient texts. They would be confronting footage, and that is exactly why the picture became the most famous piece of the entire Chronovisor story. Not because it proved the machine existed, it did not, but because it gave the claim a human centre. It connected a strange tale of secret technology to an event millions of people already felt they knew. But here is where the story takes a turn. People began comparing the alleged Chronovisor image with photographs of existing religious artwork, and the resemblance was hard to ignore. The crucified figure appeared strikingly similar to a modern sculpture of Christ, commonly linked to Spanish sculptor Lorenzo Culaut Valera. Images of that sculpture were reportedly available before the Chronovisor photograph ever appeared in print. The pose, the angle of the head, the placement of the arms, the shape of the body. For critics, this was not a distant resemblance. It looked like the same artistic source, maybe altered, maybe cropped, maybe reversed, but familiar. Imagine finding a supposed photograph of Julius Caesar taken by a machine from the future, then discovering the face matches a statue standing in a museum. The mystery does not disappear completely. People can always suggest coincidences, copies, hidden inspirations, or deliberate misdirection. But the burden changes. Now the question is not, could this be real? It becomes, why does a 1st century image look so much like a 20th century work of religious art? Supporters of the Chronovisor legend have sometimes argued that the sculpture itself may have unknowingly captured the true appearance of Christ. Maybe the artist was inspired by an older sacred tradition. Maybe both images came from some lost source. Maybe the resemblance was not evidence against the machine, but evidence that the machine had accessed something artists had somehow sensed before. That is where the story stops being a technical claim and becomes something more like faith. Because faith has always lived comfortably beside images. Icons, paintings, statues, relics, all of them try to make the invisible visible. They give shape to events no living person can verify. They turn memory into something you can stand before, touch, pray to, argue about. The Chronovisor photograph offered something even more tempting. Not an artist's interpretation, not a saint's vision, an alleged recording. But there was another problem hiding inside that temptation. If the machine could capture Christ on the cross, why was this the image people were shown? Why not the entire sequence? Why not the trial, the crowd, the tomb, the resurrection claimed by the Gospels? Why release one blurred photograph and leave the rest of history behind a locked door? That question leads directly into the strangest part of the photo's legacy. Because once you start looking at who published it when it appeared and how the story spread, the Chronovisor begins to look less like a machine with one extraordinary image and more like a mystery built around the exact kind of evidence people most desperately want to believe. And that is the point where historians start applying a different kind of pressure. Not the pressure of belief, not the pressure of ridicule, the pressure of questions. Where is the original document? Who preserved it? When was it written? Can anyone examine the paper, the ink, the technical drawings, the components, the laboratory records, the correspondence between the people allegedly involved? Because extraordinary historical claims do not become stronger just because they are dramatic. They become stronger when they leave traces, and the Chronovisor, for all the detail attached to its legend, has left remarkably few traces that can be independently verified. There are no authenticated blueprints available for scientific examination, no surviving machine, no parts catalogue, no laboratory notebook explaining how the device separated one moment in history from another, no repeatable demonstration, no confirmed recordings whose origin can be tested by researchers outside the circle of people already invested in the story. That absence does not prove that nothing ever happened. History is full of lost documents, destroyed archives, private experiments, and secrets carried to the grave. But absence changes the standard. If someone claims they once built an unusual radio, historians might accept that the device was lost. If someone claims they built a telescope nobody preserved, that is unfortunate but possible. But a machine capable of observing the past, a machine that could answer questions about assassinations, wars, ancient cities, lost languages, religious events, and every disputed moment in human history, that would not be an ordinary lost invention. It would be one of the most important devices ever created. And the bigger the claim becomes, the harder it is to explain why almost nothing solid remains. Think about the practical consequences. A real chronovisor would not just reveal whether one famous photograph was genuine. It could settle arguments that have lasted centuries. It could show the construction of the pyramids. It could reveal the final days of Pompeii. It could let scholars hear languages that vanished before anyone wrote them down. It could show what happened in rooms where history changed direction. Who killed whom? Who signed what? Who lied? Who disappeared? A machine like that would make every archive on Earth incomplete overnight. And that creates another problem for the story. Why would an institution, a government, a scientific team, or even a small group of individuals choose to keep such a thing permanently hidden? Secrecy is possible, of course it is. Governments classify weapons programs. Religious institutions protect private correspondence. Families conceal scandals for generations, but keeping a secret requires people. Engineers, technicians, funders, witnesses, assistants. Suppliers, security personnel, people who maintain equipment. People who disagree. People who eventually retire, get angry, write memoirs, leave records, or simply talk. The more complicated the alleged machine, the more people would likely have been involved. And the more people involved, the more difficult it becomes to keep every physical trace and every independent account from reaching the public. Then there is the scientific problem. The Chronovisor legend usually rests on an idea that sounds almost believable when stated in a certain way, that sounds and images from the past never truly disappear, that every event leaves behind some kind of signal, some residual imprint moving through the universe, waiting for the right machine to receive it. It is a beautiful idea. It is also not how historians or physicists understand evidence. Light does carry information, sound does travel, radio signals can move through space. In principle, an observer far enough away could see Earth as it looked in the distant past, because light from Earth takes time to travel outward. But that does not mean the past is stored around us like a video library. The light from ancient Rome has scattered into space. The sounds of vanished voices have been absorbed, distorted, and lost in the chaos of the environment. To reconstruct a precise historical scene from those fragments would require recovering information that, as far as known physics can tell us, is no longer locally available in any usable form. And even if some information remained somewhere, That is very different from building a machine that can select a date, tune into a location, and watch the result on demand. That leap is enormous. It is the difference between saying a shipwreck may contain buried treasure and claiming you can open the ocean, reach into the past, and pull out the exact conversation sailors had before it sank. Historians are trained to live with uncertainty. They work from letters, ruins, copies, fragments, financial records, propaganda errors and silences. They know the past is not a clean story. It is a damaged puzzle with most of the pieces missing. That is why a claim like the Chronovisor can be so seductive. It promises an escape from uncertainty. No more arguing over sources. No more wondering what happened. Just watch. But real history almost never gives us that luxury. And if you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is strange, incomplete, and just compelling enough to keep the door open, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. So where does that leave the Chronovisor? Probably not as a confirmed Vatican invention. There is no reliable evidence that a functioning time-viewing machine ever existed, no verifiable blueprint, and no scientific basis for the extraordinary abilities attributed to it. But the legend still tells us something real. It tells us how deeply we want the past to speak back. We do not just want artifacts. We want answers. We want to see the faces behind the old stories. We want to know whether sacred moments happened as described, whether rulers were truly guilty, whether history has been edited by the powerful. The Chronovisor offers the ultimate forbidden archive, not a locked room full of papers, but reality itself, replayed on a screen. Maybe that is why the story refuses to die. Because somewhere between faith, technology, secrecy, and history, it touches a fear almost everyone understands. What if the truth is still there, and someone else is watching it? Number 3. The Vatican's alleged UFO dossiers. Of all the rumours attached to the Vatican's secret archive, now officially called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, this may be the strangest. Not a lost gospel, not a prophecy, not a medieval treasure map, files on unidentified objects in the sky, reports from priests, bishops, missionaries, pilots, soldiers, and terrified villagers, strange lights over monasteries, machines moving silently above battlefields, objects seen crossing the night sky with no obvious explanation, and somewhere, according to the legend, a hidden Vatican collection containing centuries of encounters that never made it into the official history books. It sounds like the perfect conspiracy story, an institution that has existed for nearly 2,000 years, an institution with global reach, private correspondence from every continent, diplomatic channels, scholars, witnesses, and an archive built to preserve the record of human belief. If anyone had collected strange reports from the sky, people say, surely the Vatican would be one of the first places to look. But the UFO dossier rumour did not begin with a secret document suddenly appearing online. It grew gradually, almost the way legends usually grow. One strange event, one newspaper story, one ambiguous statement. Then decades of retelling, speculation, and details added by people who came later. To understand why people imagine Vatican files full of UFO reports, you have to go back to the years after World War II. This was the age of the flying saucer. In 1947, American pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing a formation of unusual objects moving at extraordinary speed near Mount Rainier. His description was quickly transformed by headlines into the phrase, flying saucers. Within months, reports were coming in from across the United States. Then from Europe. Then from everywhere. The sky had changed. For centuries, people had seen comets, meteors, atmospheric phenomena, unusual clouds, distant lights, and things they could not explain. But after 1947, those mysteries were being interpreted through a new lens. Not angels, not omens, not secret weapons, at least not always. Visitors. and the Cold War made the atmosphere even stranger. Governments were testing aircraft, rockets, surveillance systems, and weapons that ordinary people had never seen before. The public knew that military technology had advanced at a terrifying speed. A machine that seemed impossible one year could become a newspaper photograph the next. So when something appeared in the sky that did not fit familiar categories, people were ready to believe almost anything, including that the Vatican knew more than it was saying. One event, in particular, became central to the story. In 1954, reports emerged that Pope Pius XII had witnessed a remarkable phenomenon in the Vatican gardens. According to contemporary accounts, the Pope saw the sun appear to move, rotate, or pulse in an unusual way. The event was connected by Catholic commentators to the miracle of the sun at Fátima, the famous 1917 event reported by thousands of witnesses in Portugal. For believers, it was a sign. For skeptics, it may have been an atmospheric or optical phenomenon. But for later UFO writers, it became something else entirely. They looked at the description of a bright object behaving strangely in the sky and asked a different question. What if the Pope had not seen a miracle? What if he had seen a UFO? That single reinterpretation mattered because it placed the Vatican directly inside the modern UFO age, not as a distant religious institution commenting on strange events from afar, but as a possible witness. And once that possibility entered the story, it became easy to imagine what came next. If a pope saw something unusual, perhaps Vatican officials investigated it. If officials investigated it, perhaps they collected reports. If they collected reports, perhaps those reports were placed in an archive. And if the archive was restricted, perhaps the files were still there, locked away, waiting. This is how a rumour becomes more powerful than the original event. Each step sounds plausible when taken alone. The Vatican receives letters from around the world. That is true. Clergy have often been present during extraordinary local events. Also true. The Church has historically documented visions, apparitions, miracles, and claims of supernatural phenomena with enormous care. So why not unexplained aerial sightings too? The answer depends on what someone means by UFO today. The term often carries an immediate extraterrestrial implication. But technically, an unidentified flying object is simply something in the sky that has not yet been identified. A light can be unidentified without being alien. A witness can be sincere without being correct. And an event can be unexplained in one moment. Then perfectly ordinary once better information appears. But the mystery did not stay technical for long. As the decades passed, stories about the Vatican and UFOs began attaching themselves to certain names, certain sightings, and certain periods of history. The question was no longer whether someone in Rome had seen an unusual light. The question became whether the Church had been quietly keeping records of encounters that might challenge everything humanity thought it knew. And then the rumour took a much darker turn, because a file full of witness reports is one thing. Strange lights, unexplained objects, letters from frightened people. That would be interesting, but not necessarily world-changing. Recorded artifacts would be something else, not sightings. Not stories, physical objects, metal fragments, strange machines. Materials that could not be identified, maybe even wreckage from something that had come down from the sky. The most famous claim centres on an alleged crash in northern Italy. Years before Roswell, years before the modern UFO era had a name. The date most often given is 1933. The location is usually described as somewhere near Magenta, a town west of Milan. According to the story, an unusual craft came down on Italian soil during the rule of Benito Mussolini. It was supposedly recovered by fascist authorities, examined in secret, and placed under the control of a special intelligence group sometimes called Cabinet RS 33. Even the name sounds like it was invented for a thriller. But the people who promote the story insist it was real. They describe a strange craft, sometimes said to be cylindrical or bell-shaped, made from a material unlike ordinary aircraft construction. Some versions claim it had no visible wings, no recognizable engine, no markings that identified its origin. Other versions go much further, suggesting the object contained non-human occupants. And that is where the Vatican enters. The claim is not merely that Mussolini's government recovered something unusual. It is that, after the war, the object or its records may have passed through channels connected to the Catholic Church. Some writers have suggested that Pope Pius XII knew about the alleged craft. Others claim Vatican intermediaries helped arrange contact between Italian authorities and the Americans as the fascist regime collapsed. In the most dramatic version of the tale, the Vatican became a quiet bridge between a hidden Italian secret and the emerging American security state. Think about what that would mean. Europe is in ruins. Mussolini is dead. Germany has fallen. Allied armies are moving through Italy. Intelligence services are racing to seize weapons, scientists, documents, and anything else that might matter in the new world, taking shape after the war. In that chaos, according to the legend, a recovered object unlike any known technology is sitting somewhere in Italy. Who would control it? The defeated fascist government? The Americans, the British, the Soviets? Or an institution that had survived every government around it, had diplomatic connections across the world, and knew how to keep sensitive information locked behind layers of secrecy? The Vatican becomes compelling in this story, not because there is a clear chain of custody, but because it seems uniquely suited to the role people imagine. It was old, it was discreet, it had survived wars and revolutions. It had officials who could speak to governments without appearing to belong fully to any of them, and it had rooms, libraries, vaults and archives vast enough for people to imagine almost anything hidden inside. But the alleged magenta artifact is only one branch of the larger myth. There are also stories about objects found in remote places and quietly brought to Rome for examination. A strange sphere recovered from a field, metallic fragments handed over by missionaries, pieces of unexplained material discovered after an object was seen falling from the sky. In some versions, church officials did not interpret these things as alien technology at all. They treated them as possible signs, possible hoaxes, possible natural phenomena, or dangers requiring careful investigation before rumours spread. That detail actually makes the legend more believable to some people, because the Church has long investigated extraordinary claims. Not just miracles, but relics, apparitions, visions, bleeding statues, reports of possession, and events that could cause public panic. Before declaring something supernatural, officials often ask painfully practical questions. Who saw it? When? Could it have been faked? Is there a medical explanation? Is there a natural explanation? Does the object itself reveal anything? Now apply that same process to an object that fell from the sky. A priest in a rural parish receives a metal fragment from frightened locals. A bishop writes to Rome. Someone in the Vatican asks for photographs, witness statements, measurements, maybe a sample. The material is examined by a scientist, stored with correspondence, and eventually forgotten in a box marked with an administrative title nobody outside the archive would ever think to search. That scenario is not proof of alien artifacts, but it explains why the idea has such staying power. And if mysteries like this are exactly your kind of rabbit hole, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website, link in the description. Because once you start looking at these stories, you realize the artifact is rarely the only mystery. The paper trail around it can become just as strange. In the magenta case, the alleged trail leads toward wartime Italy, secret fascist offices, intelligence channels, and a handful of documents that believers say point to a hidden recovery program. The question is whether those documents describe something truly extraordinary, or whether later generations saw a few ambiguous clues and built an entire crashed craft narrative around them. And that question leads directly to the man whose claims pushed this story far beyond the world of Vatican rumour and into the centre of modern UFO controversy. That man was David Grusch, the former American intelligence officer whose public statements brought old Italian UFO stories back into the spotlight. Grusch did not produce a Vatican dossier. He did not walk onto a stage with a box of stamped documents from Rome. But his claims about a long-running government effort to retrieve unusual craft gave new life to the idea that the 1933 Italian case might have been part of something much bigger. And once people started looking toward the Vatican again, they found another reason to wonder. The Vatican has astronomers, not amateur stargazers in a church tower, not priests peering through a small telescope after evening mass. Real astronomers, scientists working with major observatories, publishing research, studying galaxies, planets, meteorites, stellar evolution, and the ancient history of the solar system. This surprises people because the popular image of the Vatican is frozen somewhere in the age of Galileo. A place suspicious of telescopes, suspicious of new ideas, suspicious of anything that might move Earth from the centre of creation. The real history is much more complicated. The Galileo affair was real. It was serious, and it remains one of the most famous collisions between religious authority and scientific investigation in history. But it was not the entire story. Catholic scholars had been studying the heavens for centuries. Church institutions helped preserve astronomical knowledge, support calendar reform, and educate generations of mathematicians and natural philosophers. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, the calendar most of the world still uses today. That change was not just a religious decision, it required astronomy. The old Julian calendar had slowly drifted out of alignment with the solar year. Easter, a feast tied to the cycles of the moon and the seasons, was becoming harder to calculate accurately. So the Church turned to mathematicians and astronomers to fix the problem. Think about that for a second. One of the most powerful religious institutions on Earth needed precise measurements of the sky to keep track of time. Stars, planets, eclipses, lunar cycles. They were not peripheral curiosities. They were built into the machinery of the calendar, the liturgy, and the administration of a global church. By the 19th century, the Vatican had created an official observatory known as the Spicola Vaticana. Its purpose was partly scientific, but it was also symbolic. The Church wanted to show that faith and serious scientific work did not have to be enemies. At first, the observatory operated in Rome. Telescopes were placed near the Vatican itself, including in the Leonine Tower. But Rome had a problem shared by every growing city: light pollution. The brighter the streets became, the harder it was to see the faint objects astronomers cared about. So the observatory moved to Castel Gandolfo, the papal residence outside Rome. Picture the setting: a quiet hill town overlooking Lake Albano. Gardens, villas, old stone walls, and above them instruments aimed into the darkness. Jesuit astronomers and Vatican scientists recording observations, while the rest of the world imagined the Holy See as a place concerned only with ancient manuscripts and secret ceremonies. That contrast is exactly why UFO rumours attach themselves so easily to Vatican astronomy. If the Church has telescopes, people ask, what have they seen? If it studies meteorites, what objects have passed through its hands? If it has scientists trained to distinguish a planet from an aircraft, a comet from a satellite, a natural rock from an unusual piece of material, would frightened witnesses send strange reports to them? The answer to that last question is probably yes. People have always sent unusual things toward institutions they believe possess authority. A local priest, a bishop, a university, a museum, a government office. And the Vatican, with its combination of religious prestige and scientific reputation, is almost designed to become a destination for mysteries. But the Vatican Observatory is not a hidden UFO command centre. Its work is overwhelmingly recognisable science. Astronomers connected to the observatory study the physical universe using the same methods as researchers everywhere else. They analyse light, they compare observations, they test hypotheses. They argue over data, they publish conclusions that other scientists can challenge. And because the skies above Rome became too bright even at Castel Gandolfo, the Vatican Observatory eventually established a major research centre in Arizona. Yes, Arizona. In the mountains near Tucson stands the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, often called the VAT. It is a serious modern instrument operated in partnership with the University of Arizona. The name alone has fueled endless speculation. Vatican, Advanced Technology Telescope. To some people, it sounds less like an observatory and more like the opening line of a conspiracy thriller. But its actual purpose is far less cinematic, and in its own way, far more impressive. It observes the universe. Still, the presence of Vatican astronomers creates a fascinating question. If intelligent life exists elsewhere, would the Church be shocked by it? Or has it been thinking about that possibility for far longer than most people realise? Because some of the Vatican's own scientists and theologians have given answers that are surprisingly open-minded, and those answers would become fuel for an entirely new layer of the UFO dossier legend. In 2008, Father José Gabriel Funes, then director of the Vatican Observatory, gave an interview that travelled around the world. He said that believing in extraterrestrial life did not necessarily conflict with Christian faith. If there were intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe, he suggested, they would still be part of God's creation. To some listeners, that was a thoughtful theological answer to an old philosophical question. To others, it sounded like preparation. Why would a Vatican scientist say that unless the Church already knew something? That leap is where the alleged UFO dossiers begin to grow beyond anything the evidence can support, because openness to the possibility of life elsewhere is not the same thing as proof that life elsewhere has visited Earth. A scientist can say there may be countless inhabited worlds without claiming a single extraterrestrial craft has landed in Italy, crossed Vatican airspace, or been locked in a classified Roman vault. And yet the rumour persists because at first glance the Vatican seems like the perfect place for such a secret. It is ancient, it is private, it possesses an archive with millions of documents. It has diplomatic connections stretching across the planet. It has scholars, scientists, clergy, and an institutional memory older than many modern nations. If strange reports had arrived from missionaries, bishops, soldiers, diplomats, or frightened villagers, people imagine surely somebody in Rome would have collected them. Maybe they did collect some reports. Institutions preserve strange letters all the time. A person sees lights over a field, another believes a meteorite is a sign from heaven. Someone writes to a priest claiming to have encountered an angel, a demon, or a machine descending from the clouds. History is full of witnesses trying to explain things they did not understand. But that is very different from a secret, organised Vatican archive of confirmed UFO cases. And this is the point where the story hits its hardest wall. There is no publicly verified cache of Vatican UFO dossiers, no catalogue released by the Holy See identifying files on extraterrestrial craft, no authenticated memorandum showing popes were briefed on recovered objects, no confirmed chain of custody for strange materials, no archive box photographed, examined and verified by independent historians. No leaked inventory with Vatican seals that can be traced to a real office, a real date, and a real official. Nothing solid. That does not mean every unusual report connected to Catholic history is automatically false. It does not mean people have never seen unexplained things in the sky. And it does not mean the Vatican has no confidential records at all. Of course it does. Every major state, religious institution and diplomatic body has records that remain restricted for legal, pastoral, political or personal reasons. But secrecy by itself is not evidence of UFOs. That is a distinction conspiracy theories often blur. A locked door becomes proof of what is supposedly behind it. A missing document becomes proof of its most dramatic possible contents. An institution's silence becomes a confession, but historians have to work in the opposite direction. They ask what can actually be shown. Where is the document? Who wrote it? When was it created? Where has it been kept? Can its paper, ink, language, stamps, signatures and references be independently examined? Does it match the administrative habits of the period it supposedly came from? Without answers to those questions, a story may be fascinating. It may even be possible, but it is not established. And that is what makes the Vatican UFO dossier legend so durable. It survives not because it has been proved, but because it is difficult to disprove every version of it. The supposed files are always somewhere deeper, somewhere more restricted, somewhere just beyond public reach. If no document appears, believers say that proves the cover-up is working. If a document does appear and fails authentication, they say the real files are still hidden. It is a theory built to resist evidence by turning the absence of evidence into evidence itself. If you enjoy mysteries like this one, the kind where rumour, history, and missing records overlap in strange ways, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Just remember, the best mysteries do not become less interesting when we separate fact from speculation. They become sharper. The Vatican does have vast archives. It has received correspondence from every corner of the world. It has lived through wars, revolutions, scientific discoveries, political scandals and panics in the sky. Somewhere in its records there may well be letters describing strange lights, unknown objects, celestial omens, or events witnesses could not explain. But as of now, there is no public evidence that those fragments add up to a classified Vatican UFO program. No confirmed dossier, no authenticated artifact file, no proof of a hidden ecclesiastical archive tracking visitors from another world. Just a powerful idea, an ancient institution, and the irresistible feeling that somewhere behind those guarded doors, someone knows more than they are saying. And that feeling has created another kind of missing document entirely. Not one supposedly hidden in a sealed archive, but one rumoured to have been erased because its message was simply too dangerous to preserve. Number 4. The original Gospel of Barnabas. This is one of the most explosive texts ever connected to Christian history. Not because it contains a secret code or a prophecy about the end of the world, but because of what it says about Jesus himself. According to the Gospel of Barnabas, Jesus was not God. He was not the divine Son in the sense taught by the major Christian churches. He was a human prophet, chosen by God, speaking truth to Israel, performing miracles by God's permission, and warning people to return to righteous living. In this version of the story, Jesus is honoured enormously. But he is not worshipped, and that is only the beginning. The text presents itself as the testimony of Barnabas, the early Christian figure named in the New Testament as a companion of the Apostle Paul. If you know the traditional Christian story, that name immediately gives the document weight. Barnabas was there in the earliest decades of the movement. He knew the first believers. He travelled with Paul. A gospel carrying his name sounds like it could be a window into Christianity before councils, creeds, and centuries of theological argument hardened into official doctrine. That possibility is exactly what makes people lean closer. Because the Gospel of Barnabas tells a version of Jesus' life that repeatedly collides with the familiar New Testament account. In its pages, Jesus insists that he is not the Messiah people are waiting for. He says the true Messiah will come later, and the name given for that future messenger is Muhammad, not vaguely, not through a line that can be interpreted 6 different ways. The text directly identifies Muhammad by name, portraying him as the awaited messenger whose coming Jesus foretells. For Muslim readers who encounter the book, that can feel astonishing. Here appears a gospel associated with a companion of the apostles, apparently affirming a central Islamic belief that Jesus was a prophet who announced the coming of Muhammad. For many Christian readers, it feels equally astonishing for the opposite reason. If such a text really came from the earliest Christian world, it would challenge some of the most foundational claims in Christian theology. But before anyone decides it has overturned 2,000 years of history, we need to understand what the book actually says. Because its story is stranger, more detailed, and more dramatic than the headline version, the Gospel of Barnabas follows Jesus through preaching, healing, arguments with religious authorities, and long conversations with his disciples. Like the canonical Gospels, it presents a teacher surrounded by crowds, a man capable of miracles, and a figure whose words provoke powerful reactions. But the theology behind those scenes is very different. Jesus repeatedly rejects divine status. He is described as a servant of God. At one point, the text has him react with anguish when people begin to treat him as more than a prophet. He does not accept worship. He does not claim equality with God. Instead, he calls people away from what the book portrays as a terrible misunderstanding. In this account, the idea that Jesus is God is not a truth revealed by him. It is an error people will make after him. Think about how radical that is. The traditional Gospels show Jesus speaking and acting in ways Christians have understood as revealing a unique divine identity. The Gospel of John begins with the Word becoming flesh. The letters of Paul describe Christ in cosmic terms. Across centuries, Christian doctrine developed around the belief that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. The Gospel of Barnabas turns that entire structure upside down. Jesus is still holy, still miraculous, still central. But he is not the final revelation of God in human form. He is the messenger before the final messenger, and then the book reaches the event at the centre of Christianity, the crucifixion. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus is arrested, condemned, crucified, dies, and rises again. That sequence is not a minor detail. For Christianity, it is the heart of the story. The cross becomes the symbol of sacrifice, redemption, death defeated, and humanity reconciled with God. But the Gospel of Barnabas gives us a completely different scene. Jesus is not crucified. Instead, the text says that Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, is transformed so that he looks like Jesus. Judas is arrested in his place. Judas is mocked in his place. Judas is nailed to the cross in his place. The people watching believe they are seeing Jesus die. But according to this gospel, they are witnessing a case of divine substitution. Jesus, meanwhile, is taken away alive. It is a startling reversal. The betrayer becomes the condemned man. The prophet escapes. The execution that defines Christian history becomes, in this telling, a vast misunderstanding. That idea resembles a belief found in Islamic tradition, where Jesus is not understood to have been successfully crucified in the way Christian doctrine teaches. But the Gospel of Barnabas does more than simply deny the crucifixion. It builds an entire alternate explanation around Judas, deception, divine intervention, and the confusion of witnesses. And it does not stop there. The text also teaches that circumcision remains important, criticizes religious practices it considers corrupt, and offers long warnings about pride, greed, hypocrisy, and the dangers of turning religious leaders into objects of unquestioned obedience. It is deeply concerned with judgment, deeply concerned with moral discipline, deeply concerned with the difference between outward religion and actual obedience to God. There are passages where Jesus speaks at extraordinary length, explaining heaven, hell, sin, repentance, and the fate of the soul. The tone can feel less like 4 short biographies written close to the events they describe, and more like a massive theological argument placed into the mouth of Jesus. And that raises a question that cannot be avoided. If this gospel contains such extraordinary claims, where did it come from? The answer begins with 2 manuscripts, not a cave full of scrolls, not a first-century fragment pulled from the sands of Judea. 2 relatively late handwritten texts, appearing centuries after Barnabas himself would have lived. The most famous is written in Italian. Today it is kept in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, catalogued as Codex 2662. It is a substantial manuscript containing the full Gospel of Barnabas across hundreds of pages and 222 chapters. This is the version most modern readers encounter, directly or indirectly. When people quote its statements about Jesus, Muhammad, Judas, or the crucifixion, they are usually quoting this Italian text, and the manuscript itself has an unusual feel. It is written in Italian, but it was bound in a style that some observers have described as resembling Ottoman or Middle Eastern bookbinding. That detail has fueled endless speculation. Was it made in a Muslim environment? Was it copied by someone fascinated with the Islamic world? Was it a Christian text that travelled east and came back west? Or was the binding simply the product of a European collector's taste for exotic-looking books? The problem is, a binding can tell you something about a book's journey. It cannot automatically tell you where its words were written. Still, the Italian manuscript's trail is strange enough to keep the mystery alive. By the early 18th century it had entered the library of Prince Eugene of Savoy, a celebrated military commander, statesman and obsessive collector of books. Prince Eugene's library was enormous. It contained manuscripts in many languages, rare printed works, maps, documents and texts gathered from across a Europe constantly trading, fighting and exchanging ideas with the Ottoman world. After his death, much of that library was acquired for Vienna's imperial collection. And there, among thousands of manuscripts, sat this alternative gospel attributed to Barnabas. Imagine opening it without knowing anything about the arguments surrounding it. You see a long gospel in elegant Italian. You see the name Barnabas. And then, chapter after chapter, you encounter a version of sacred history that does not line up with the New Testament most Christians know. That alone makes it easy to understand why people began asking whether the book had been hidden away. But the Italian manuscript is only half of the story. There was also a Spanish version. Unlike the Italian manuscript, the Spanish original is no longer known to survive. That fact matters, because a lost document is almost guaranteed to attract theories. Some say it was destroyed. Some say it disappeared into a private collection. Some imagine it remains uncatalogued in an archive somewhere, waiting for the right person to recognize it. The evidence is more limited than those stories suggest. What researchers have is not the original Spanish manuscript itself, but an English rendering based on a Spanish text. That English manuscript survives in a library collection in Australia, preserving a translated form of what the Spanish version reportedly contained. So now we have a puzzle with 2 pieces. One is a complete Italian manuscript in Vienna. The other is a Spanish tradition known through an English translation, while the Spanish original itself has vanished. They are not identical in every tiny detail, but they broadly tell the same story. That suggests they are connected somehow. The question is how. Did the Spanish version come from the Italian one? Did the Italian version come from the Spanish one? Did both descend from an earlier lost source? Or were they shaped separately by writers and copyists who shared the same religious arguments? This is where manuscript history becomes less like a straight line and more like a tangled family tree. Books did not move through the past with neat labels attached. A manuscript could be copied in one city, rebound in another, translated by someone with an agenda, sold by a collector, inherited by a nobleman, and catalogued under a title nobody bothered to investigate for 100 years. One missing link in that chain can turn certainty into guesswork. And if you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is real but the answers remain just out of reach, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. Now, supporters of the Gospel of Barnabas often point to the existence of both the Italian and Spanish traditions as proof that the text must have had a much older history. After all, why would there be more than one version unless the book had been circulating for generations? It sounds persuasive at first, but multiple versions do not, by themselves, prove an ancient origin. They prove transmission. They prove that somebody copied, translated, adapted, or preserved the work. What they do not reveal automatically is who first wrote it, where they wrote it, or what sources they had in front of them. And when scholars began looking closely at the language, the historical references, and the world reflected inside these surviving manuscripts, the mystery took a very different turn. That is why dating matters so much. If the Gospel of Barnabas were genuinely written in the 1st century, or even close to the lifetime of the Apostles, it would be one of the most important Christian documents ever discovered. It would not simply be an unusual gospel. It would be evidence that the earliest followers of Jesus preserved radically different memories, arguments, and theological debates than the ones found in the New Testament. It would force historians to reconsider the entire landscape of early Christianity, because the first few centuries after Jesus were not simple. There was no single, fully organized church speaking with one voice from the beginning. There were communities in Judea, Syria, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and North Africa. They spoke different languages. They read different texts. They argued over law, ritual, leadership, prophecy, and the identity of Jesus himself. Some Gospels became widely accepted. Others were rejected, forgotten, or survived only in fragments. So the idea of a lost early Gospel is not inherently impossible. We know early Christian writings existed that later disappeared. We know some texts were debated for centuries before being included or excluded from the biblical canon. That is the opening through which the Barnabas mystery enters. Maybe, supporters ask, this was one of those lost voices. Maybe it survived outside the official tradition. Maybe its late manuscripts are only the final copies of a much older work, copied and recopied until the original vanished. It is a possibility in the abstract, but history does not date a text by asking whether something could have happened. It dates a text by looking for fingerprints, language, vocabulary, geography, politics, social customs, the kinds of arguments the author seems concerned with. The books and ideas the author appears to know. Every text carries traces of the world that produced it. And when scholars examine the Gospel of Barnabas that way, many conclude that its fingerprints point not toward 1st century Judea, but toward medieval or early modern Europe. Think about it like finding a letter supposedly written by Julius Caesar. The paper might look old, the handwriting might be convincing. But if the letter mentions gunpowder, parliamentary elections, or a country that did not exist until 1,000 years later, the claim collapses. The document may still be fascinating. It may still preserve older legends. but it cannot be exactly what it claims to be. With the Gospel of Barnabas, the concerns are more subtle than that, but the principle is the same. The language of the surviving tradition appears to belong to a much later world. The cultural atmosphere feels shaped by centuries of contact, conflict, and debate between Christian and Muslim societies. Some passages appear to reflect medieval European assumptions. Some details seem more at home in the Italy and Spain of the late Middle Ages than in Roman-controlled Judea. That does not mean every line must have been invented at one moment by one person. Texts can be layered. An author can borrow older traditions. A copyist can add material, a translator can reshape phrases, a later writer can place ancient names on a new work, because those names give it authority. That last practice has a name, pseudepigraphy. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. A text is written under the name of someone famous from the past. In the ancient and medieval worlds, this happened constantly. Books circulated under the names of apostles, prophets, kings, philosophers, saints, and legendary sages. Sometimes it was deliberate deception, sometimes it was literary tradition. Sometimes a community honestly believed it had preserved teachings associated with a revered figure, even if the actual author was unknown. So a book carrying Barnabas's name does not prove Barnabas wrote it. In fact, the name itself may have been chosen precisely because it carried weight. Barnabas was an early Christian figure associated with Paul and the first generation of the Church. He was important enough to give a later work an aura of apostolic authority, but distant enough from the surviving record that someone could build a new narrative around him. That makes his name useful. It sounds authentic. It feels close to the origins. And for readers already suspicious that powerful institutions had hidden the real story, it becomes almost irresistible. But the dating question changes everything. A first-century Gospel of Barnabas would be testimony from the earliest Christian era. A medieval Gospel of Barnabas would be testimony from a completely different era, an age when Christianity and Islam had been arguing, trading, translating, conquering, and influencing one another for hundreds of years. Those are not remotely the same historical situations. One would tell us something potentially revolutionary about Jesus and the apostolic generation. The other would tell us something equally revealing, but very different, about the religious anxieties of the medieval Mediterranean world. And this is where the argument gets especially complicated. Because scholars do not all assign the text to the exact same decade. Some have argued for a late medieval origin. Others place its formation closer to the 16th century. A few defenders have tried to push an earlier core beneath the later layers. The gap between those possibilities may sound like an academic disagreement, but it is actually the heart of the mystery, because once people believe a document contains a dangerous truth, the next question almost asks itself: who hid it? For believers in the Gospel of Barnabas as an ancient suppressed text, the answer is obvious: the Vatican. The claim usually goes something like this. Church authorities discovered a gospel that challenged central Christian teachings. They recognized that its contents could undermine their power, so they removed it from public view, destroyed competing copies, locked away the original, and allowed only altered versions to survive outside the official record. It is a powerful story, maybe too powerful, because it turns the absence of evidence into evidence of the cover-up. No ancient manuscript. The Vatican destroyed it. No catalogue entry. The Vatican concealed it. No official statement admitting suppression. Well, of course they would deny it. That is exactly what a secretive institution would do. And once an argument reaches that point, it becomes almost impossible to test. Imagine someone tells you there is a treasure buried under an old castle. You ask where the map is. They say the king burned it. You ask whether anyone saw the treasure. They say the witnesses were silenced. You ask why there is no record of any excavation. They say the records were erased. Maybe the story is true, but every missing piece cannot automatically become proof that the story happened. That is the problem historians face with the Vatican suppression claim. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, despite the dramatic name, is not a single locked room filled with every forbidden book in human history. It is an enormous collection of papal records, correspondence, legal documents, financial accounts, diplomatic reports, and administrative material gathered across centuries. Much of it has been catalogued. Scholars from around the world have worked there. Researchers do not have unlimited access to every document, and some collections remain restricted for preservation, privacy, or institutional reasons. But that is very different from proof that an original Gospel of Barnabas is sitting in a secret vault. There is no publicly verified Vatican manuscript of an ancient Gospel of Barnabas. No established archival reference number. No authenticated photograph. No confirmed report from a qualified manuscript scholar who examined it. No chain of custody reaching back through late antiquity. Just claims. And the claims often grow larger as they travel. A blog repeats a video. A video cites an unnamed Vatican insider. A social media post says a Turkish manuscript was recovered. Then another post says Rome tried to buy it. Then someone else claims the Pope personally ordered it hidden. By the time the story has crossed the internet 100 times, speculation starts sounding like documentation. But repeat a rumour often enough, and it does not become a source. It becomes a louder rumour. That does not mean the Church has never suppressed texts, censored books, or controlled access to ideas. It absolutely has. The history of Christianity includes disputes over heresy, banned writings, destroyed manuscripts, and political struggles over which teachings were acceptable. The Catholic Church maintained an index of forbidden books for centuries. Religious authorities, like governments and empires, have often tried to regulate what people read and believe. So suspicion did not appear from nowhere. The real history gives the conspiracy theory just enough fuel to keep burning. But there is a major leap between saying institutions have censored books and saying the Vatican possesses the original Apostolic Gospel of Barnabas and has secretly hidden it for nearly 2,000 years. Those are completely different claims. The first is historically documented. The second requires evidence that has not appeared. And here is something else worth considering. If church authorities had truly encountered a text they believed was dangerous, they would not necessarily have needed to lock it in a vault. In many historical controversies, opponents preserved the very writings they condemned. They quoted them. They refuted them. They copied passages in order to attack them. Heretical texts survived precisely because critics wrote about them. A truly explosive ancient gospel would likely leave echoes. Arguments against it. References in sermons. Notes in catalogues. Complaints from bishops. Mentions in the long and messy paper trail of Christian intellectual history. The silence is not absolute proof that no such original ever existed. History rarely gives us absolute proof, but silence matters when a claim is this enormous. And that is why the Gospel of Barnabas remains so fascinating. Not because we can confidently say the Vatican buried the real story of Jesus. We cannot. But because the legend reveals how desperately people want to believe that somewhere, behind a sealed door, there is one document capable of overturning everything. Maybe that desire is not really about Barnabas at all. Maybe it is about the feeling that official history is too neat, too controlled, too complete. People look at ancient institutions, locked archives, missing manuscripts, and centuries of religious conflict, and they sense a gap. Into that gap, a forbidden gospel fits perfectly. If you want to go deeper into stories where the evidence gets stranger the closer you look, Our book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description. But for now, the careful conclusion is less dramatic than the legend. The Vatican suppression story is possible in the broadest imaginable sense. Almost anything lost to history is possible, but possibility is not confirmation. And without an authenticated ancient manuscript, a reliable archival trail, or independent evidence that such a text was ever held and concealed by Rome, the claim remains what it has always been. A compelling theory built around a missing document. And speaking of records that may have been altered, erased, or perhaps never existed in the first place, the next story takes us to the papal throne itself. Because for centuries people have whispered that one pope was not a man at all. Number 5. Pope Joan's erased papal records. This is one of the most enduring stories ever attached to the Vatican. Not a lost gospel, not a secret machine, not a hidden treasure chest buried beneath St. Peter's. A person, according to the legend, sometime in the early Middle Ages, a woman disguised herself as a man, rose through the ranks of the Church, and was elected Pope. She took the name John. She ruled from the papal throne. Bishops bowed before her, clerks recorded her decisions. Pilgrims received her blessing, and for years nobody knew. Then, during a public procession through Rome, the secret ended in the most shocking way imaginable. She gave birth. Picture it. Medieval Rome. Narrow streets packed with clergy, guards, merchants, beggars, pilgrims and ordinary citizens. The Pope is moving through the city in full ceremonial dress, surrounded by the machinery of religious authority. Bells, prayers, incense, embroidered robes, all the symbols of a church that claimed spiritual power over kings and kingdoms. Then, the person at the centre of it all suddenly collapses. In the legend, Pope Joan goes into labour in the street. There are different versions of what happens next. In some, the crowd is horrified and turns violent. In others, she dies from the birth itself. In still others, she is quietly removed, hidden away by church officials desperate to contain the scandal. But the central image never changes. The Pope was a woman, and the Church, according to the story, erased her. It is almost too perfect a legend, a secret identity. A forbidden ascent to power, a public revelation, a cover-up by one of the most powerful institutions on earth. It has everything a story needs to survive for centuries, and it targets one of the most male-dominated offices in history. Because the papacy was never just a religious position. A pope could crown emperors, launch crusades, settle disputes between kingdoms, issue laws, collect taxes, command armies through allies, and shape the beliefs of millions. To imagine a woman sitting in that office, not by permission but by deception, was scandalous. To imagine the entire church fooled by her was even more scandalous. The legend usually begins with a young woman described as exceptionally intelligent. Her name changes depending on who is telling the story. Sometimes she is Joan, sometimes Agnes, sometimes she is said to have come from England, which is why one version calls her John Anglicus, John the Englishman. Other versions place her origins in Germany or somewhere else entirely. But the basic plot remains the same. She is hungry for education in a world where formal learning is overwhelmingly controlled by men. So she dresses as one disguised. She studies theology, philosophy, scripture, maybe even the complicated legal traditions of the medieval church. Her intelligence is so obvious that she gains respect wherever she goes. That detail matters. Pope Joan is not usually portrayed as a villain in the oldest versions of the tale. She is not a sorceress. She is not a seductress plotting her way into Rome. She succeeds because she is brilliant, more brilliant apparently than the men around her. She travels to Rome. She enters church life under her male identity. She teaches. She gains powerful supporters. Her reputation grows until after the death of a pope, the cardinals choose her as his successor. And that is where the story becomes almost surreal. For roughly 2 years, depending on the version, the highest authority in Western Christianity is supposedly a woman in disguise. She celebrates Mass, she receives foreign visitors, she makes appointments, she signs documents, she sits in judgment over religious questions that will affect the lives of people who never know the truth. Think about the pressure of that deception. Every meal shared with other clergy, every ceremonial robe, every physician called during an illness, every day spent in the intensely male world of medieval Rome. One mistake could end everything. Yet in the legend she survives not for a night, not for a week, but long enough to become pope, until she falls in love. Again, the details shift. Some tellers say she had a secret lover. Others simply say she became pregnant. But eventually the disguise could no longer protect her. The body itself became the evidence, and suddenly this private secret became public history, or at least public legend. The location of the supposed birth became part of the tale too. Later Romans pointed to streets and claimed the disaster happened there. Some traditions insisted papal processions avoided a particular route because of what had occurred. Others connected strange papal rituals and ceremonial chairs to the fear of another woman reaching the throne. That is how legends take root. They do not remain only words on a page. They attach themselves to stones, streets, buildings, objects and rituals. A passerby sees an old monument and hears, "That is where Pope Joan fell." A visitor notices an unusual chair and hears, "That was used to make sure the Pope was really a man." Maybe none of it happened. Maybe every detail grew over time. But once a story is tied to a place, it begins to feel physical. It begins to feel remembered, and Pope Joan was remembered with remarkable confidence. Not as a vague rumour about a woman near the Vatican. Not as a whispered possibility, but as a pope with a name, a reign, a secret, and a terrible ending. Which raises the question that turns this from a strange medieval story into an alleged Vatican mystery. If she really existed, where did her records go? The strange answer is that the story does not appear when it supposedly happened. The woman called Pope Joan is usually placed in the 9th century, somewhere around the years after the death of Pope Leo IV. If a pope had really collapsed during a public procession, given birth in front of Rome, and exposed one of the greatest deceptions in church history, you might expect the scandal to explode across the written world. Rome had clerks, monasteries had chroniclers, kings had courts, bishops sent letters. Political enemies of the papacy watched every Roman crisis with hungry attention. And yet, for centuries, there is no surviving account of a female pope from the time she was supposed to have ruled. Then, roughly 400 years later, the story appears. Not in a secret Vatican document, not in a dramatic confession from a cardinal, not in a papal record accidentally left unburned in some locked room beneath Rome. It appears in a chronicle written by a Dominican friar in France. Around the middle of the 13th century, a writer named Jean de Mailly included a brief version of the tale in a chronicle of world history. His account was not exactly the fully developed Pope Joan story people know today. The woman was not even clearly given the familiar name Joan. But the basic accusation was there. A woman disguised as a man had supposedly become pope. Her identity had been revealed when she gave birth, and afterward, according to the account, she was removed from the official line of pontiffs. That is the first known appearance of the claim in surviving written history. Think about what that means. For generations, the alleged event existed nowhere we can reliably point to. Then suddenly in the 1200s, it enters the record in a form that is already shocking, already specific enough to make readers stop and already framed as something the Church had tried to hide. But John de Mailly was writing in a world that loved stories with moral lessons. Medieval chronicles were not newspapers in the modern sense. They mixed political history, religious teaching, inherited rumour, miraculous events, local traditions, and cautionary tales. A chronicler might report a battle, a royal marriage, a comet, a monster, and a sinner receiving divine punishment, without drawing the hard line between fact and story that historians demand today. That does not mean every medieval chronicle was fiction. Far from it. Many preserved details modern historians would otherwise never know. But it does mean a story entering a chronicle was not automatically a verified event. Sometimes it was a story considered too powerful, too useful, or too widely repeated to leave out. And Pope Joan was useful. It could be read as a warning about deception, a warning about sexual sin, a warning about ambition, a warning that even the grandest human institution could be humiliated by hidden wrongdoing. Depending on who repeated it, the lesson could change completely. For some people, it was proof that women were dangerous when they stepped beyond the roles assigned to them. For others, it was a savage joke at the expense of arrogant church officials. Imagine being told that the cardinals, bishops, scholars, and princes surrounding the Pope had all failed to notice that the man on the throne was not a man at all. The story did not just challenge the papacy, it made the papacy look foolish. And in the 13th century, that kind of story could travel fast. Friars moved between cities. Students travelled to universities. Pilgrims carried tales across borders. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, adding comments, changing phrases, and sometimes expanding a few lines into an entire episode. A rumour that began as a brief anecdote in one chronicle could become far more detailed every time someone retold it. If you enjoy mysteries where the line between record and rumour gets blurry, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries goes much deeper into cases like this. You can find it through the website link in the description. What happened next is where Pope Joan became almost impossible to erase, whether she was real or not. A few decades after Jean de Mailly wrote his account, another chronicler gave the story a much bigger stage. He supplied details that made the unknown woman feel less like a rumour and more like a missing person from history. A name, an origin, a place in the sequence of popes. And once those details entered circulation, Pope Joan was no longer just a strange tale told by a French friar. She became a figure people could argue about as if they had known her. That chronicler was Martin of Opava, also known as Martinus Polonus. Writing in the late 13th century, he placed the mysterious woman directly into the papal sequence. According to his version, she was an Englishwoman called John Anglicus, though later retellings would call her Joan. She had studied in Athens, travelled to Rome disguised as a man, impressed the clergy with her learning, and risen through the ranks until she was elected pope. And Martin gave her a precise location. She supposedly ruled after Pope Leo IV and before Pope Benedict III. That detail changed the entire nature of the mystery. Now people had a place to look, not just in stories, in lists. Papal lists are supposed to be simple. One pope dies, another is chosen, and the names continue in sequence like links in a chain. But medieval history is almost never that neat. Dates could be uncertain. Elections could be disputed. Messengers could take weeks to carry news across Europe. A pope might be elected, consecrated, challenged by a rival, imprisoned, restored, or recognized differently in different places. And when people began comparing old lists of popes, they found exactly the kind of mess that makes conspiracy theories thrive. Some manuscripts were incomplete, some had brief entries, some copied earlier errors, Some listed rival claimants differently. Some gave slightly different dates. In an age before printing, there was no single master copy sitting on every desk in Europe. A papal list in one monastery might not perfectly match one kept in another city. To believers in Pope Joan, those inconsistencies looked like scars. The alleged gap centred on the year 855. Leo IV died in July of that year. Benedict III eventually succeeded him. But eventually is the word that gave the legend room to breathe. Benedict's election was not smooth. A powerful rival claimant, Anastasius, was pushed forward by political forces in Rome. For a brief and confusing period, the city had competing factions, competing claims, and no clean, universally accepted story unfolding in real time. Picture Rome at that moment. The Pope is dead. Clergy and nobles are arguing. Imperial power is involved. One candidate is elected. Another is installed by force. Letters are being sent. Alliances are shifting. Nobody has the luxury of standing back and saying, let's make sure future historians find this easy to understand. That kind of chaos creates blank spaces. Not necessarily literal empty years, but spaces where later writers can insert a missing figure and make the story feel possible. If Benedict's position was delayed, contested, or poorly recorded in one source, could someone have ruled in between? Could a name have been removed? Could the confusion surrounding Anastasius have covered something even stranger? That is the question Pope Joan's defenders kept asking. And there were other peculiarities in the papal record that made people suspicious, even when they had nothing directly to do with her. Papal numbering is full of oddities. There are popes with the same names, separated by disputed claimants. There are antipopes, men recognized by some factions and rejected by later official lists. There are cases where an elected pope died before formal consecration, leaving later historians unsure whether he should count at all. Even the name John, the name attached to Pope Joan in some versions, comes with its own strange historical baggage. For centuries there was no Pope John XX in the usual numbering. The sequence appears to jump from John XIX to John XXI. To modern readers, that sounds like a missing person. Where did John the XX go? The answer involves medieval counting errors and confusion over earlier popes and antipopes. But once people already believed that a female Pope John had been erased, that missing number looked almost too perfect. It became another loose thread in the fabric of the story. Not proof, not a confession, but the kind of anomaly that makes a legend feel less like a legend. And that is how hidden history theories survive. They do not need a complete document. They need uncertainty, a damaged manuscript, a disputed date, a gap in a copied list, a number that does not quite line up. Then imagination does the rest. The Vatican's archives, with their miles of shelves and centuries of records, became the perfect imagined hiding place. If Pope Joan had been removed, people argued, the evidence would not be sitting in public. It would be buried in a restricted register, a corrected chronicle, or a papal file that no outsider was ever meant to see. But there is a problem with that theory, and it begins with the records that were never controlled by Rome at all, because Rome did not control every pen in Europe. The 9th century was not a world with one central database. Monasteries kept chronicles, kings kept charters, bishops wrote letters, imperial officials recorded political events, foreign churches preserved their own copies of important documents. And a pope was not some obscure local official who could vanish without anyone noticing. The Bishop of Rome was a major player in European politics. If a woman had ruled as pope, even briefly, scholars would expect traces beyond the Vatican. Not one perfect document with the words Pope Joan was here. History almost never gives us that. But something, a letter addressed to her, a hostile reference from a rival bishop, a diplomatic record, a coin, a legal ruling, a complaint from an emperor, a chronicle written far from Rome, saying that the Church had elected an unusual new pontiff. Instead, for the years where Joan is supposedly placed, the evidence points toward the messy but very real succession of Benedict III. This is the part believers often underestimate. Benedict was not invented centuries later to cover a gap. He appears in records connected to his own lifetime. There are letters, ecclesiastical references, and material evidence tied to his papacy. His position was contested by Anastasius, yes. The situation was confusing, absolutely. But confusing is not the same thing as empty. Think of it like a crowded train station during a power outage. People are shouting, schedules are wrong. Two conductors are claiming authority. Nobody knows which platform to use. Later, someone could easily misremember exactly what happened. But that does not mean a secret passenger became station master, ran the entire system, and was erased by every witness in the city. That is the leap the Pope Joan theory requires, and it gets harder when scholars look at the story itself. The earliest versions do not come from the 9th century. They appear centuries later. That is a massive problem. A gap of several hundred years is enough time for rumours to grow roots, for satire to become history, and for one writer's anecdote to be copied by another until it acquires the weight of tradition. Medieval chroniclers were not necessarily lying, but they worked differently from modern historians. They compiled stories, they repeated earlier accounts. They included moral lessons, miracles, strange births, warnings from God, and tales designed to show what happened when power became corrupt. A learned woman disguising herself as a man, rising too high, then being exposed in public. That is not just a political story. It is a medieval cautionary tale built almost perfectly for its audience. And once a story like that enters a respected chronicle, it can spread fast. Copyists reproduce it, preachers use it, opponents of the papacy weaponize it. Later writers add names, locations, dates, and increasingly dramatic details. Every retelling makes the story feel more solid, not because new evidence has appeared, but because the old story has gained more decorations. That is one of the strange rules of historical myth. The longer it survives, the more detailed it becomes. But detail is not the same thing as proof. If you enjoy mysteries where the line between evidence and legend gets incredibly thin, the book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website link in the description, because Pope Joan is exactly that kind of case. The mystery is real. But the mystery may be why so many people believed the story, not whether the story happened. There is also the practical issue of an alleged Vatican cover-up. To erase a pope completely, church authorities would have needed to alter records across a fractured medieval world. Not just Roman documents, they would need to reach monasteries in France, archives in Germany, imperial court records, letters sent to bishops, copied papal lists, and texts already circulating outside their control. And they would need to do it so thoroughly that no contemporary enemy of Rome preserved the scandal. That would be an astonishing operation for any government. For 9th century Europe, with slow travel, handwritten manuscripts, rival factions and weak communication, it would be nearly impossible. Ironically, the Church did not hide its embarrassing history very well. Medieval papal history contains assassinations, corrupt elections, rival popes, political deals, imprisoned clergy, family dynasties, and spectacular public failures. The record is chaotic because the institution was chaotic. If the Vatican had the power to erase every uncomfortable truth, history would look much cleaner than it does. It does not. So scholars reject Pope Joan not because they think powerful institutions are incapable of hiding things. Institutions can hide documents, they can shape narratives, they can protect reputations, but extraordinary claims need evidence strong enough to survive the simplest question. Where are the contemporary traces? For Pope Joan, there are no reliable ones. There is a later legend. There are confusing papal lists. There is a real disputed succession that created the perfect opening for speculation. And there is a story so compelling that people kept repeating it long after historians had found reasons to doubt it. Maybe that is why the legend refuses to die. It is not really about one possible woman in medieval Rome. It is about the fear that history is written by the people who win, and that somewhere behind every official record there might be a name someone wanted us to forget. And that suspicion leads to another vanished record people swear exists. This time, the missing document is said to list a treasure so vast that kings, popes, and secret orders may have spent centuries trying to keep it buried. Number 6. The Hidden Templar Treasure Inventory. If Pope Joan is the story of a person supposedly erased from history, the Knights Templar are the story of an entire institution that seemed to vanish almost overnight. And according to one of the most persistent legends in European history, they did not vanish empty-handed. Somewhere, believers say, there was an inventory, a complete accounting of everything the Templars owned. Gold, silver, land, relics, debts owed to them by kings. Perhaps objects so politically dangerous that no king, pope, or inquisitor could safely admit they existed. The document is supposed to have been hidden, destroyed, or removed before anyone could seize it. But before we get to the missing inventory, you need to understand what happened to the Templars. Because this was not a small religious brotherhood losing a few church buildings. This was one of the richest, most connected and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. And then, on one Friday morning in 1307, the King of France moved against them. Picture this. It is before dawn. Across France, royal officers are opening sealed letters sent weeks earlier by King Philip IV. The instructions had been prepared in secret. The orders were not to be read until a specific date. And when that date arrived, the officers knew exactly what to do. Arrest every Templar they could find. Not just the famous knights in white cloaks with red crosses. Not just the masters of major commanderies. Everyone connected to the order. Knights, priests, administrators, servants, elderly veterans. Men who had spent decades managing farms, collecting rents, caring for travellers, or preparing for a war in the Holy Land that was already slipping beyond Christian control. The date was Friday, October 13th, 1307. Yes, that Friday, the 13th. The connection between that date and bad luck has probably been exaggerated over time. There is no simple line from the Templar arrests to every superstition people repeat today. But the coincidence is impossible to ignore. One of the most coordinated political crackdowns in medieval history began on a Friday the 13th, and for the men caught inside it, there was nothing mystical about it. It was a catastrophe. The charges were devastating. The Templars were accused of heresy, blasphemy, idol worship, obscene rituals, financial corruption, and denying Christ during their secret initiation ceremonies. Some accusations claimed new members were forced to spit on the cross. Others said they worshipped a mysterious head. Others described rituals so bizarre that even medieval chroniclers struggled to tell them without sounding uncertain. And that uncertainty matters. The Templars were secretive. Not necessarily because they were hiding some ancient forbidden religion, but because military orders had internal rules, closed ceremonies, internal discipline, and information they did not want rivals to know. In an age of religious fear and political suspicion, secrecy could look like guilt. But King Philip did not simply wake up one morning and decide to punish an obscure group of monks with swords. The Templars had money, a lot of it. They did not begin as bankers. Their original mission was brutally simple. After the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 99, Christian pilgrims began travelling to the Holy Land in huge numbers. The roads were dangerous. Bandits, raiders, local wars, and long stretches of hostile territory turned pilgrimage into something close to a gamble with death. Around 1119, a small group of knights formed in order to protect pilgrims. They were poor, at least officially. Their early name was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Poor fellow soldiers. That was the image. But the order grew fast. European nobles donated land. Kings granted privileges. Popes gave protection. Wealthy families left estates to the order in their wills, hoping to gain spiritual benefits or support the crusading cause. The Templars received farms, vineyards, mills, churches, houses, villages, rights to collect tolls, rights to graze animals, rights to harvest forests, and income from rents that continued year after year. They built a network, and that network stretched from England to Iberia, from France to Italy, from the German lands to the eastern Mediterranean. There were Templar commanderies in rural areas, urban houses in major towns, port facilities, storehouses, churches, workshops, and agricultural estates. Each property generated income, stored supplies, trained personnel, or supported the military mission in the East. Think of it like this. The Templars were not sitting on one mountain of gold inside one castle. Their wealth was distributed across a medieval system of logistics. A manor in France might produce grain, a vineyard might produce wine, a flock of sheep might produce wool, a townhouse might collect rent, a port might move supplies, a donor in England might leave money for crusading campaigns. A commandery in Italy might manage the transfer of funds toward the Mediterranean. Individually, these assets could seem ordinary. Together, they created something extraordinary. An international organization able to move resources across continents. That is why the Templars became associated with early banking. Again, the legend is often bigger than the reality. They were not a modern bank. They did not invent all financial systems. Medieval merchants, Italian city-states, Jewish lenders, monasteries, royal treasuries, and other religious institutions all played important roles in the economy. But the Templars had a rare advantage: trust. A pilgrim or nobleman could deposit money with the order in one place and receive funds elsewhere through letters of credit and internal records. Instead of carrying bags of silver across bandit-filled roads, someone could travel with a document that authorized payment at another Templar house. That did not make robbery impossible. It did make the journey safer. And when you can safely transfer wealth over long distances in an era where distance itself is dangerous, people notice. Kings noticed too. Philip IV of France had spent heavily on war. He had fought England. He had struggled with powerful nobles. He had clashed bitterly with the papacy. He had manipulated currency. He had taxed clergy. He had expelled Jewish communities from France and seized property and debts connected to them. Philip was a ruler under enormous financial pressure, and he was willing to use extraordinary methods to solve ordinary problems of money. The Templars were not merely rich, they were visible. Their Paris headquarters, the Temple, was one of the safest places in the kingdom to store valuables. The French royal treasury itself had been kept there at times. That detail is almost too perfect. The king trusted the Templars with royal wealth, while also understanding exactly how extensive their resources were. So when Philip ordered the arrests, people naturally asked the obvious question. Was this really about heresy, or was it about property? The answer may be both, which is often the least satisfying answer and the most historical one. Medieval power rarely operated through a single motive. Religious accusations could be sincerely believed by some people, politically useful to others, and financially convenient to a king who wanted control over a wealthy institution. But here is where the hidden inventory theory starts to take shape. Because the Templars' property was documented. That is the part people sometimes miss. The order was not rich because it had stumbled across a chest of ancient coins and buried it under a chapel floor. Its wealth came from records, charters, donations, rent rolls, land grants, account books, legal privileges, inventories of livestock, grain, weapons, tools, vestments, and supplies. The medieval world ran on parchment. If you owned land, you needed proof. If a noble family donated an estate, someone needed to preserve the deed. If a tenant owed rent, someone needed to know how much, when, and in what form. A sack of silver can disappear. A legal claim to a manor can last for centuries. And the Templars had claims everywhere. Some properties were grand. Major estates, fortified houses, urban headquarters. Others were almost painfully ordinary. A field, a mill, a few acres of woodland, a right to use a water source, a share of a harvest, a small annual payment in grain, wax, cheese, or coin. But that is exactly how durable wealth works, not as one glittering pile, but as thousands of small streams flowing toward the same institution. Imagine trying to seize all of it. You would need to know where every commandery stood. Which brothers managed it? What lands belonged to it? Which tenants paid it rent? What livestock were on its farms? What debts were outstanding? Which documents proved ownership? Which valuables had already been moved? Which records were stored locally, and which had been copied somewhere else? And in October 1307, as royal officers began forcing open Templar doors across France, that question became urgent. What exactly did the king expect to find? Maybe he expected gold. Not a few coins in a locked chest. Not the ordinary cash reserves needed to pay servants, buy grain, repair roofs, feed horses, or keep a commandery functioning through winter. Philip may have expected something much bigger. A concentrated reserve of wealth. The kind of treasure that could solve a king's financial problems in one brutal morning. And this is where the historical record and the legend begin moving in different directions. The Templars clearly possessed valuable things, precious metal vessels used in worship, seals, weapons, horses, stored grain, livestock, furniture, manuscripts, money collected from rents and donations. Some commanderies held more than others. A major urban house could have substantial resources. A rural estate might contain mostly farm equipment, animals and account books. But no surviving account of the French seizures reveals one spectacular continent-shaking hoard. No endless chamber of gold, no vault packed with jewels from Jerusalem. No crate marked property of Solomon's temple, and for people who believe the Templars had become unimaginably rich, that absence is not an answer. It is the beginning of the mystery, because if the order had wealth spread across Europe, and if the king moved with coordinated force, then where was the movable part of that wealth? The silver that could be carried, the gold that could be hidden, the reliquaries that could be packed into crates, the private records that could identify secret deposits, confidential loans and people who owed the Templars more than they wanted anyone to know. Maybe there was no hidden fortune. Maybe the legends took an organization with extensive property and turned it into a medieval version of a secret superbank. That is possible, but medieval Europe was full of rumors precisely because wealth could move quietly. A chest could leave a port at night. A trusted brother could ride away with documents in his saddlebag. A ship could sail before a royal order reached the coast. and once an object disappeared into the confusion of war, politics, and accusation, it could become almost impossible to trace. Picture this. You are a Templar administrator in the months before the crackdown. You do not necessarily know that the king has sealed orders waiting to be opened, but you know the political climate is dangerous. The crusading project has collapsed. The order has enemies. The king is deeply in debt. Rumours are spreading. Former members are making accusations. Powerful people are asking questions about your finances. What do? Do you keep every document in one place and wait? Or do you make copies, move portable valuables, send money to trusted houses outside France, place records with allies, convert some assets into forms that are harder to seize? Not because you have discovered some occult secret, but because any large institution under threat would try to protect itself. That possibility is ordinary. It does not require hidden tunnels beneath Paris or a fleet carrying the Ark of the Covenant across the Atlantic. But ordinary possibilities can create extraordinary legends. One of the most famous stories says that shortly before the arrests, a Templar fleet escaped from the French port of La Rochelle. The ships, according to later retellings, vanished into the Atlantic carrying the order's treasure, its archives, and perhaps its highest-ranking members. It is a perfect story. La Rochelle was a major port. The Templars had connections to maritime trade. A fleet can disappear beyond the horizon in a way that a wagon train cannot. And the word vanished does a lot of work. Once the ships are gone, they can go anywhere. Scotland, Portugal, Spain, the Mediterranean, even in some of the wildest versions, North America. The problem is that the evidence for a dramatic escape fleet is thin. There is no solid contemporary record describing dozens of Templar ships loading treasure under cover of darkness and sailing away just before Philip's men arrived. Historians do not simply dismiss the idea because it sounds exciting. They dismiss the confident version because a claim that large needs large evidence. A fleet crews, cargo port activity supplies, and destination arrangements would normally leave traces somewhere. That does not mean no Templar ship ever departed La Rochelle. It means we cannot confidently transform a gap in the record into proof of an escape operation. And yet, the story survives because it answers a question people cannot stop asking. If the treasure was not found, did it sail away? From there, the legend branches like a river after a flood. One branch leads north to Scotland. In this version, surviving Templars fled after the destruction of their order and found protection under Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king fighting for independence from England. Some later stories claim Templar knights appeared at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 and helped secure Bruce's great victory. It is an irresistible image, armoured fugitives in white mantles, emerging from the woods at the decisive moment to turn the battle. But again, contemporary evidence is not there. The earliest detailed accounts of Bannockburn do not describe a secret Templar force changing the outcome. Scotland may have been a place where individuals connected to the order could disappear more easily than in France, but that is not the same as proof that the Templar treasury crossed the sea and financed Scottish independence. Still, Scotland became important to the myth because it offered something France did not: distance. Distance from Philip, distance from papal investigators, distance from the places where the order's property could be seized and redistributed. And when treasure stories need a place to hide, distance is almost as useful as a locked door. Another branch leads to Portugal. This one has more historical ground beneath it, though not necessarily the buried gold version. In Portugal, the king did not simply allow all Templar resources to evaporate into the hands of outsiders. A new order, the Order of Christ, eventually inherited much of the former Templar presence and property, under a different name and structure. That fact has inspired generations of speculation. Did the Templars survive by changing uniforms? Did their wealth survive with them? Did their secret knowledge become part of Portugal's later age of exploration? There is a real historical transformation here. Former Templar assets and traditions did not vanish in exactly the same way everywhere. But the leap from institutional continuity to secret treasure maps and forbidden relics is much larger than it first appears. It is one thing for land, buildings and personnel to be transferred into a new religious order. It is another to claim that a hidden inventory directed Portuguese ships toward unknown continents. The legend, however, loves that leap, because Portugal sailed farther than almost any European kingdom had sailed before. Its explorers rounded Africa, reached India, crossed oceans, and built routes that changed the world. For believers, it is tempting to imagine that somewhere behind those voyages sat old Templar charts, old Templar money, or old Templar secrets. But history is often more complicated and less cinematic. Portuguese expansion came from royal ambition, naval development, trade, geography, warfare, religious motives, and generations of accumulated knowledge. You do not need a lost Templar vault to explain it. Though a lost vault makes for a much better campfire story. And that is the strange power of this mystery. The missing treasure is never only money. Sometimes it is said to be the Holy Grail, sometimes the Ark of the Covenant, sometimes a sacred head, connected to the old accusations against the order, sometimes secret gospels, ancient maps, coded manuscripts, or proof that Christianity's official history was built on a lie. Every generation seems to place its own forbidden object inside the Templar chest. In the 19th century, as Romantic writers became fascinated with Gothic ruins, secret societies, and the medieval past, the Templars transformed from disgraced warrior monks into guardians of hidden wisdom. Later writers linked them to Freemasons. Treasure hunters linked them to castles, caves, and remote chapels. Modern conspiracy theories linked them to almost everything: banking dynasties, lost bloodlines, coded cathedrals, and shadow governments supposedly operating behind history. The evidence grows weaker as the story grows grander. But the hunger behind it is real. People do not just want to believe the Templars hid gold. They want to believe that power can be concealed, that official history leaves things out, that somewhere beneath the records we have been allowed to see is another record explaining everything. And if you love mysteries that sit right on that line between documented history and the stories people build around its gaps, there is a book covering 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website link in the description. Now, some treasure legends are attached to very specific places. Take Rennes-le-Château, a tiny village in southern France that became famous because of stories surrounding a 19th century priest named Berenguer Saunière. The claim, in its many versions, is that he discovered a hidden secret connected to the Templars, the Merovingians, the Holy Grail, or an immense cache of treasure. The story has inspired books, films, hoaxes, and endless theories. But the trail is a warning. Much of the modern Rennes-le-Château mythology was built from later inventions, embellished documents, and claims that collapse when you trace them back. It is not evidence that the Templars hid treasure there. It is evidence that once the Templar name gets attached to a place, the legend can become almost impossible to kill. Then there is Oak Island, a small island off Nova Scotia, famous for its supposed money pit, where generations of searchers have dug for buried treasure. Over the years, the possible contents have multiplied: pirate gold, Shakespeare manuscripts, French royal jewels, and, inevitably, Templar treasure. The Templar version usually depends on the La Rochelle escape story. If ships escaped France, perhaps they crossed the Atlantic. If they crossed the Atlantic, perhaps they buried something. If they buried something, perhaps it is waiting beneath an island that has already swallowed enormous amounts of money, machinery, and hope. But every step in that chain is speculation stacked on speculation. It does not become stronger because the final destination is dramatic. And yet there is one version of the vanished treasure story that is harder to dismiss because it requires no ships, no buried chambers, and no sacred relics at all. What if the greatest Templar treasure was not a hoard? What if it was information, not the obvious records of farms and rents? Something more sensitive, lists of debtors, private correspondence, deposits made for nobles who wanted discretion, evidence of loans to rulers, political agreements, names of people connected to the order in ways they did not want exposed. A king can seize land, he can confiscate silver, but a document revealing who owes whom, who financed which war, who made which promise, and who betrayed which ally can be more valuable than gold. And that brings us back to the missing inventory, because perhaps people have been looking for the wrong kind of treasure all along. And this is where the Vatican's own surviving trial records become so important, because they do not reveal a neat list titled, "Here is where the Templar treasure went." What they reveal is something messier, a vast, frightened institution being dismantled through interrogations, legal arguments, papal commissions, confiscations, and testimony given under conditions that were often brutal. The records show men trying to save themselves. They show officials trying to establish control. They show the Church trying to decide whether the accusations against the order were true, politically useful, or impossible to ignore. And between all of that, they show the outlines of a financial mystery. The Templar trials began under the shadow of the French crown, but they quickly became a papal problem. King Philip had made his move. He had arrested the brothers in France and seized what he could. But the Templars were a religious order. They answered, at least in theory, directly to the Pope. So Pope Clement V was forced into a difficult position. If he simply accepted Philip's accusations, he risked looking like a king's instrument. If he defended the Templars too strongly, he risked confronting one of Europe's most powerful rulers. And if the order really had committed heresy, then the Church could not simply look away. The result was an enormous investigation. Papal commissions questioned Templars across Europe. Witnesses were called. Former brothers testified. Local church authorities gathered statements. Documents were copied, sealed, sent onward, translated, summarized, and preserved in legal registers. This is one reason the Templar mystery has endured for so long. There are records, thousands upon thousands of words, enough to make the story feel almost within reach. But records are not the same thing as clarity. Many of the most famous confessions came after torture or the threat of torture. Some Templars admitted that they had denied Christ during initiation rituals. Some described spitting near or on a cross. Some mentioned strange kisses, secret words, or a mysterious head. Others later withdrew their confessions, saying they had spoken only because they feared pain, prison, or death. Imagine trying to reconstruct the truth from that. A man is arrested before dawn. His property is seized. He is separated from his fellow brothers. He is told that others have confessed. He may be tortured. He may know that resisting could mean years in a cell. Then he gives a statement. Is he revealing a secret? Or is he saying whatever he thinks will make the questioning stop? The Vatican trial records preserve that uncertainty. They do not give us a clean answer about the rituals, but they do show how total the pressure had become. The order was not simply being investigated. It was being broken apart, piece by piece, until its members could no longer coordinate a defence or protect whatever private knowledge they may have held. And that matters for the treasure question, because a secret inventory would not necessarily look like a treasure map. It could be a ledger with coded names, a register of deposits, a list of trusted agents, instructions for debts to be collected after the order's collapse, a correspondence file identifying assets held beyond the reach of French officials. It could even be something as ordinary as a list of keys, seals, and account locations. The kind of document that sounds boring until you realize what it could unlock. The trial records contain constant concern over possessions, revenues, obligations, and the future disposition of Templar resources. This was not surprising. The order had estates, income streams, legal rights, and movable goods scattered across kingdoms. Once the Templars were under attack, everyone wanted to know who would control those resources next. But what the surviving records do not contain is just as interesting. There is no universally accepted, surviving master inventory of the Order's hidden portable wealth. No authenticated document that says, on this date, these chests of silver were sent here, these jewels were entrusted to this person, these private accounts are held under these names. That absence does not prove a secret inventory existed. It only tells us that if such a document existed, it has not survived in any confirmed form. And considering the chaos of the period, that is not impossible. Archives burn, papers rot, seals are broken, records disappear during war. Officials keep what helps them and discard what does not. A ledger that protected an enemy's financial network would have been useful to a king, useful to the papacy, useful to rival orders, and potentially dangerous to almost anyone named inside it. Some documents were certainly preserved, others were certainly lost. The question is whether the most valuable records were among the lost ones. There is one surviving set of documents that often gets pulled into this larger mystery, the Chinon parchments. These records, created in 1308, describe a papal hearing involving the highest leaders of the order, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay. For centuries, the parchments were effectively buried within the Vatican collections, not necessarily locked away as forbidden knowledge, but overlooked, miscatalogued, and unknown to most historians. When their significance was recognized and publicized in the modern era, people immediately saw proof of a Vatican cover-up. But the real story is more complicated. The Chinon parchments show that papal representatives heard the leaders' confessions and granted them absolution in a sacramental sense. That does not mean the Pope declared the order innocent of every charge. It does not mean the Templars were fully restored. And it does not mean the Vatican possessed proof of a hidden treasure and concealed it for 7 centuries. What it does show is that the official story was never as simple as guilty men exposed, case closed. Even at the centre of the Church, there were distinctions. There were legal procedures. There were questions about authority. There was uncertainty over what exactly the Templars had done, what had been forced from them, and what should happen next. The order was eventually suppressed in 1312. Not, strictly speaking, through a final sweeping verdict that proved every accusation beyond doubt, but through papal action shaped by scandal, political pressure, and the fact that the institution had become almost impossible to preserve. That distinction is crucial. The Templars were not erased because someone opened a vault and found the secret of the world. They were erased because medieval politics, royal debt, religious authority, fear and accusation converged on them at exactly the wrong moment. Still, the trial records leave behind an uncomfortable possibility. A large institution does not operate across Europe without paperwork. It does not receive donations, manage estates, lend money, travel between kingdoms, supply men and horses, and maintain relationships with nobles without generating records. Some of those records entered official hands. Some may have moved into the archives of successor institutions. Some may remain unidentified in collections under different names. and some may simply be gone. That is why people swear the hidden Templar inventory must exist somewhere in the Vatican's vast archival world. They imagine a file removed from the public record, a sealed dossier listing the wealth Philip never found, a final report written by papal investigators, too politically explosive to reveal. It is a compelling idea, but compelling is not the same as confirmed. The surviving Vatican material gives us no verified hidden inventory, no coded location of buried gold, no proof that the Grail, the Ark, or some forbidden relic passed through Templar hands. What it gives us is arguably more haunting, a documentary trail of a powerful order collapsing while its enemies fought over the remains. And maybe that is enough to explain the legend. When people see a vast organization fall, they assume something must have escaped. A secret, a fortune, a document, a truth too valuable to be left behind. Sometimes the missing thing is real. Sometimes it is only the shape created by missing records. But in the Templars' case, that shape has lasted more than 700 years. And as long as there are sealed archives, vanished ledgers, and unanswered questions about where power keeps its secrets, people will keep believing that somewhere, in a forgotten file or a hidden chest, the final Templar inventory is still waiting to be found. And maybe that is the real secret behind the Vatican's so-called forbidden archive. Not that there is one locked room containing every answer humanity has ever wanted. Not necessarily a shelf holding the full prophecy of Fátima, blueprints for a machine that watches the past, photographs of visitors from other worlds, a gospel that rewrites Christianity, proof that a woman sat on the throne of St. Peter, or a ledger leading straight to lost Templar gold. The truth is probably more complicated, and in some ways much more interesting, because the Vatican Apostolic Archive, despite the name people still imagine as something dark and forbidden, is not a fantasy dungeon beneath Rome. It is an archive, a massive, ancient, constantly expanding collection of letters, trial records, diplomatic reports, financial documents, petitions, papal correspondence, and fragments of human lives preserved across centuries. It contains real secrets in the ordinary historical sense. Private negotiations, uncomfortable accusations, political betrayals, confessions, warnings, decisions made by powerful people who believed their words would never be read outside a small circle. And when an archive holds that much history, it creates a powerful illusion. People begin to believe that every unanswered question must have an answer somewhere inside. The Third Secret of Fátima is a perfect example. We know a text exists. We know the Vatican released a version of it. But because prophecies are symbolic, because officials gave different interpretations, and because the Cold War filled the world with fear, many people remain convinced that something more apocalyptic was held back. Maybe they are wrong. Maybe they are responding to a very human discomfort with incomplete answers. Then there is the Chronovisor, a story so strange it almost demands belief or disbelief. A machine built by scientists and priests, capable of observing the past itself. No verified device, no surviving blueprints, no evidence strong enough to establish that it ever existed. But the story survives because it touches an ancient desire. If you could look into the past, what would you watch? The crucifixion? Caesar crossing the Rubicon? The burning of Rome? The last words of people whose voices have been lost forever. The Chronovisor may be a legend, but it is a legend built around a question that never stops haunting us. What if the past is not truly gone? The alleged UFO dossiers work in a similar way. The Vatican has spoken seriously about astronomy, the possibility of life beyond Earth, and the theological questions that would come with it. That is real. But real openness to cosmic possibility is not the same thing as confirmed files about crashed craft, alien visitors, or secret agreements with beings from another world. Still, the idea persists, because if any institution had received reports that challenged humanity's place in the universe, people imagine the Vatican would be one of the first places those reports might end up. The Gospel of Barnabas carries an even deeper kind of mystery, not because we have an authenticated first-century manuscript hidden in a vault. We do not. The known versions are much later, and historians have serious reasons to question their origins. But the legend survives because religious history is full of lost texts, disputed traditions, rejected writings and communities whose beliefs did not become the official version of Christianity. People do not just wonder whether a gospel was hidden. They wonder how many voices from the ancient world were never allowed to survive. Pope Joan is different again. Her story may not be supported by the contemporary evidence historians would expect for a real medieval pope. But for centuries, people repeated it as fact. They placed her in chronologies. They pointed to statues, rituals, and gaps in the record. Why? Because the story gives shape to another suspicion, that institutions do not merely preserve history, they also decide how history gets told. And the Templars, perhaps more than any other missing Vatican document, show why that suspicion can feel reasonable. The order was real. Its wealth was real. Its trial records are real. Its destruction was shaped by real political pressure. Yet the records remain incomplete, fragmented, and full of uncertainty. Somewhere between what survives and what vanished, a legend was born. Maybe there was no final inventory, maybe there was. But the missing document matters because it represents everything. People fear power can conceal wealth, influence, knowledge, and the evidence of who truly controlled the outcome. So do these 6 missing documents exist? Some are based on genuine records that remain disputed. Some are tied to real events but have grown into legends. Some are probably inventions, misunderstandings, or stories that became too compelling to die. And some remain possible only in the narrowest sense. Not proven, not impossible, but unsupported by the evidence we currently have. That is where history has to be careful. A missing document is not automatically a suppressed document. A sealed archive is not automatically a cover-up, and a story repeated for 100 years is not automatically true. But skepticism does not mean the mysteries are worthless. The mysteries tell us what people are afraid has been hidden from them. They reveal the gaps between official history and public trust. And sometimes, as with overlooked documents like the Chinon parchments, they remind us that archives can still surprise us. There are probably extraordinary discoveries still waiting in collections around the world. Not necessarily proof of time machines or secret alien dossiers, but letters that change how we understand a pope, records that reveal a forgotten political alliance, testimony from someone history almost erased, a single page that forces historians to rethink an entire event. And honestly, that is amazing enough. If you enjoyed exploring these Vatican mysteries, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Which of these 6 documents do you think is most likely to exist in some form? The full Fátima text? The Templar inventory? Or do you think the Chronovisor story has more truth behind it than anyone wants to admit? And tell us where you are listening from. We always love seeing how far these stories travel. If you want to go deeper, check out our book about 12 unexplained mysteries through the website link in the description. And if you're listening on Spotify, that is one of the best ways you can support the channel. So follow the show there using the link in the description. Because somewhere right now in an archive, a library, a private collection, or a box nobody has opened in generations, there may be a document waiting to change what we think we know. The question is not whether history still has secrets. It does. The question is whether we will recognize the truth when one of those secrets finally comes to light.